Claire Khaw. Anyone who watches Doooovid on Week in Review or various streams, I appear on Claire's channel quite often, and been speaking with her about various things. Thought I'd invite her onto my channel to have a discussion about various topics, specifically principles in terms of personal principles that people apply to themselves, such as Claire's common topic of the seven
I think you need to mute.
Noahide laws. And so I'll let Claire briefly introduce herself to anyone on my channel that hasn't heard of her before.
Hi everyone, I'm Claire Khaw. I promote secular Koranism and a whole host of other ideas that you may find radical and possibly repellent, but I'm having fun. I enjoy I enjoy introducing ideas and would like to argue their validity and soundness on certain principles that I think will be discussed on this stream. So I think that's all I need to say about myself for the moment. Obviously, I'm a political activist, and I'm trying a few ideas out on people. So I hope you'll be patient with me.
Okay, yeah, Claire has appeared on my channel, I think 3 times. The first one for a chat. I'm gonna put that one link in the chat on Secular Koranism, and also she appeared on a stream of mine on the history of civil rights, and also on one of the Ask the Rabbis about specifically answering her questions, and maybe she was on another Ask the Rabbi, but the second one on Lashon Hora. For anyone who hasn't, secular Koranism is kind of not a religious version of Islam, but just very basic, would be using Islamic, the Quran, as jurisprudence for the larger law in society, and to some extent that is possibly what's happening if you look at the various. But we're not going to be talking about secular Koranism today. We want to talk about principles. So anyone who watches Week in Review regularly knows me and Jennifer have been doing slides on logic and debate. Claire Khaw and Jennifer had a debate on Church of Entropy's channel about personal versus impersonal God, and we're hoping to have more debates. So we've been reviewing the basic laws of logic, and so Claire came up with some questions and concept about principles, which is similar to logic. And so I don't know if Claire, you want to introduce what you want to discuss about principles.
Well, I think a lot of problems we have in politics is about people not following their principles, and I think this has led to is leading to the breakdown of law and order because people basically think they can get away without following the rules. And we've got to the stage where people are not even sure what the rules are and whether there's any point in following them. And I thought, asking a few questions on the purpose, the nature and purpose of principles would help us clear our heads about why we must follow rules, and of course I understand why people don't want to follow rules. But that's all, the price we have to pay, I think, for a society that is not on the verge of, collapse, yes, because I think eventually that is what it will lead to if everyone ignores their principles or doesn't even have them and doesn't care that they don't have them. And and also I think religion is really the best way of educating people about principles, because if you don't have religion then you really don't quite get the nature and purpose of them. And I'm just hoping that perhaps Doooovid will agree with me and expand on this a little bit.
Yeah,
If he
maybe we might get into the exact logic behind it, because I know you were on the stream with me and Church of Entropy about Gödel's incompleteness theorem, which is not the level of personal moral principles or principles how a person guides their life, but a pure logical formulation of principles in an axiomatic way, which probably derives from the ancient Greeks like Euclid, and the idea of having a logical structure and having a few postulates or axioms from which everything else could be derived. And me and Church of Entropy's long arguments about Gödel's incompleteness theorem, which Gödel argues that you can't actually have a complete and consistent set of rules that to derive that won't contradict itself, and that's not even referring to a personal level. We're talking about like a pure logical structure, like a computer program, or a mathematical definition. Like, I mean, did you study Euclid as a child and geometry and the axioms and the derivation of larger principles based on those basic axioms?
I'm afraid my memory is very hazy, and I actually know very little about Gödel's theorem. So
You were on that stream with me and
I
Church of
know I
Entropy.
was just saying it was rubbish, but actually I don't know what it was. It didn't it seemed to be saying that there are things that we cannot possibly know, and I thought, well, obviously there are so many things we can't possibly know. Why do we need to even say this in a very complicated way?
Just for the the logical introduction, the principled nature to say we're going to be talking more about people and belief systems and politics and morals as opposed to pure logical derivations. But Euclid obviously has the basis of geometry, and he has your few basic axioms like the shortest distance between 2 points is a line, parallel lines never cross, and things related to that until you could derive complicated geometric rules based on those basic axioms, and anyone who's done basic mathematics has worked with those. And all of engineering and science is largely based on these principles of having proven things and then deriving things based off of the precursors that have been proven. And then comes along Gödel, and then there becomes problems and there of how do you define the axioms? Can you really be so sure about the axioms? Or what is truth? How do you know 100% truth? And here we're not talking about humans at all. We're talking about just the laws of nature that, in theory, would be true whether humans existed or not, such as is the shortest distance between 2 points a line or not, and so most of this is probably beyond the scope of that. But when we talk about principles for a person, presumably we have the idea that a person has certain
Moral
moral
principles.
yeah, certain moral principles and their action could be derived and consistent with those principles. So, like, obviously, like Doovid, is a Hasidic Jew, and there's certain laws in Orthodox Judaism, and the derivation to people who point out conflicts in Doovid as a person. You're saying Doovid is a deeply flawed person because how could he be an Orthodox Jew and a Hindu at the same time? That clearly there has to be some violation of principles there because the action of Doovid clearly is a violation of some principle
The
from
principle against idolatry.
yeah, or can you be more than one religion at the same time, even if it wasn't idolatrous, or various things. But yeah, I mean, clearly, like, okay, Judaism is an anti-idolatrous religion. So how is it that Duvid is a Hasidic Orthodox Jew and at the same time a Hindu and practices idol worship, which would blatantly be some form of contradiction? Then you say, oh, okay, what does it mean that a person is in fact contradicting themselves? Does it mean they're like in a mathematical formula where you have to go back to the starting boards? Obviously, people contradict themselves all the time, and just because people break their rules and principles, what does that mean? Like, it's no longer a person. Obviously, people are deeply flawed and deeply contradictory, but they still go about their life. They still could conceivably be productive members of society. They could still have philosophy, and you think of people maybe like Alan Dershowitz or Noam Chomsky or Einstein, who were very great people in given fields of law, linguistics, or physics. But then when you look at them as a person or their ideas in the greater world, you say like these people don't really know what they're talking about. They're blatantly contradicting themselves. But what does that mean that they've broken their principles?
Well, I suppose having principles allows the other people to identify you and judge you according to what they think your principles are supposed to be. So if you go around saying you're a Jew or Hasidic Jew, then they'll have, a set of principles that they associate with Hasidic Jews. And if you don't conform to them, they'll say, well, maybe this is not a typical example, or and that's how I guess we judge people. It's a bit like the no-hide laws, isn't it? It's a minimum moral standard of behaviour that Jews would use to judge Gentiles for righteousness, for example. So if they fall below those standards, then they're not righteous, and if they satisfy those standards, then they are righteous. And I suppose working on that basis, Jews would associate with Gentiles who are righteous and shun those whom they regard as not righteous.
Yes, I guess.
So that would be a use of principles.
I guess there's principles. The concept that there's certain overall laws that are more important than others, and people's decisions on smaller things could be derived from their decisions on larger things, as opposed to okay, me and Claire Khaw know each other. I mean, obviously we're overseas. She's in London, and I'm in Detroit. But we've talked possibly hundreds of hours and know each other reasonably well. And I could say this is Claire Khaw's opinion on hundreds of various issues. So as opposed to just knowing her opinion on every single given issue and having to memorize it, there concept of a principle, that there's certain principles, so even if I don't know where she stands on a given issue,
you can predict it based on what you know about me, I suppose.
So is like for people who listen to Doooovidism on consciousness, or Church of Entropies, we can review about cognitive dissonance in kind of the brain as a prediction machine. So is being unprincipled just mean the person is harder to predict, or does it make a difference that a person is unprincipled? In your circles, you probably come across it a lot of times with you possibly you might contemporarily be referred to as racism or identity, where people like, okay, I don't want to have any, I don't really, God forbid, like this group of people. But then there's this one person from that group of people that I kind of like and maintain as a friend, which would appear to be a contradiction of principles.
Um,
Right? If you say, okay, I don't like X group of people, God forbid, and then there's one person from that group of people and say, I make an exception for this person and I have a friendship with this person, even though they belong to this group of people that I don't really like, is that a good example of a contradiction of principles? Or can you derive some greater principle?
It depends on what you think you're doing. As a political activist, you will obviously have to be always talking to people who don't agree with you, who take the opposite view to you. So you just be on your own if you only want to talk to people who agree with you, and you would be wasting your time preaching to the converted. So of course, as a political activist, we must talk to people who disagree with us and actually make a point of doing so.
Yeah, I mean, since you're not necessarily that mathematical of a person, we don't have to put it into mathematical terms, but in terms of weighted principles, where you'd have some sort of value or weight to a principles, and then you might have principles that contradict each other, but you have various principles that have a given weight, and say, okay, Doovid likes wealthy people, Doovid likes successful people, and then but there's also contradiction. Doovid doesn't like people who act and accord themselves in a certain way, and then you have, okay, but this person's wealthy and successful and accords themselves in a certain way, and then you have to weigh your principles. So it's pretty unlikely, like Gödel's incompleteness theorem, that you're not going to be able to be completely consistent. It's impossible to have a consistent system, but you could have some sort of weightness, like we talked, God forbid, about the beta trade and things like that, where, like, let's say, an attractive woman or something, like, okay, who would you consider marrying as a partner? And say, well, obviously I want a, Jewish woman who shares my values. But then there could be other values. You want an attractive woman, you want a successful woman, you want an intelligent woman, and there might be contradictions. Like you say, well, what if you find all of the qualities, but that woman's Christian? Would that make it so that it doesn't matter if everything else you were looking for a woman uh, you found in her except she was Christian? Or is that somehow a complete value statement where this coming back to Gödel's incompleteness theorem, where it's basically impossible you're going to be able to go through life without contradicting at least some of your principles quite often.
Yes, yes, I was once put in a very difficult position of whom I would choose to marry, you or Luke Ford. I can't remember my answer now. I think it was a horrible choice, and I couldn't work out which. Um, and I suppose I think I plumped for you simply because you were the more Jewy Jew. If I were to, work on that basis. So I don't know. And then I realised, of course, you're not, technically a halakhic Jew. So it was, a kind of what's a word, Scylla and Charybdis of a choice.
Yeah. So you know, I don't know how much you want to get into in depth, and so what type of principles should a person have? Um, what are the main type decisions that you're looking at in principles where there's are there either or type issues? Like, for example, you had the Israeli elections the other day, and there's principles that appear pretty clear that divide people between political parties, like secular state or religious state, two-state solution or one-state solution, capitalist or socialist. And so relatively in Israeli elections, you could clearly define political parties based on their stances on various issues. And a lot of these things are kind of like spectrums, where it's not like a person's completely one way or another, but they're clearly on one side of the spectrum, that there's political parties that are clearly defined. So when you vote for a given party, at least in terms of certain issues, you relatively know what you're getting.
Well, I perhaps I'm being a little eccentric, but I think Israel of all countries should be a theocracy. So, is there a party that you can vote for in Israel that actively promotes a theocracy?
Well, yeah, I mean, Agudas Yisrael, I mean, the United Torah Judaism and Shas, which got, I think, there's 120 seats in parliament, and United Torah Judaism and Shas combined got 17 seats in the House, I mean, in the Senate, which is a little more than 10%. And
How
both
many seats are there? 72?
120.
Oh, right. For some reason, I thought it should be 72.
I mean, 72 is the historical, like, Sanhedrin, or 70.
Hmm.
Uh, but so I mean, it's a vast minority, where hardly 15%, less than 15% of the political seats believe Israel should be a theocracy. And that's the big divide in the politics right now, where Netanyahu's coalition, which includes the Haredi parties — Netanyahu doesn't necessarily believe in a theocracy, but includes those parties in his coalition — and his coalition has fallen apart due to Lieberman, who basically represents Russian Jews, said he refuses to sit in the same coalition with the ultra Orthodox Jews, and hence it looks like there might have to be a third election, which was why the coalition fell apart in the first place. So, whether your opinions on Israel being a theocracy or not, that's a relatively unpopular position in Israel, and it's one of the critical issues that's causing Netanyahu to possibly lose his prime ministership. If he fails to make we'll see what happens. Even if he fails to make a coalition, if no one else could make a coalition.
Well, it seems to me that liberal democracy is coming to the end of the line. If it's failing in Israel, then I think it's in our circles it is perceived to have failed. Very significantly, because we keep being asked to participate in elections, and we still never get what we want. Brexit is a case in point. We voted to leave 3 years ago, and we're still stuck at the door, neither in nor out. And I think that the patience of people are wearing thin, and I think a lot of people are prepared to give up democracy in order to get their way.
Yeah, so the one advantage of the U.S. and the two-party system is that you don't have the problems of forming a coalition. You obviously have the big divides, and there's different problems in a two-party system. But if the UK and Israel are facing similar problems, where there is such division on various issues, the identity of the country, how to move forward in terms of global politics, that there is no way to form a ruling coalition and get to the heart of the identity. And I put in the group evolutionary strategy in the title here. Think like Israel, where you have people that basically have the same genetics. Being let's say largely 100% Ashkenazic Jewish, and then you have your Sephardic or Arab Jews. Even though they're called Sephardic Jews, a lot of these Jews are more Arab Jews. But so the Arab Jewish Party got 9 seats out of 120 of the ultra Orthodox, and I think you got 8 seats from United Torah Judaism, which is your ultra Orthodox Ashkenazic Jews. But their counterparts who basically share the same blood but are secular are more than them. So just like in America, your Orthodox Jews who are basically 100% genetically Ashkenazic Jews only represent about 10% of the American Jewish public. And you have a lot of intermarriage, but there's probably a chunk of 30 to 50% of American Jews that are also pretty close to 100% Ashkenazic Jewish that are secular. And they, so on a genetic way, there's very little difference between your average American secular Jew and your average American Orthodox Jew. Like, what's the difference between Freud, Marcuse, your Frankfurt School, Einstein, so on and so on, and Haredi Hasidic rabbi, and basically none. Genetically, they're basically the same ethnicity.
Surely the only way to judge a Jew is by his observance.
Well, no, I'm saying there's also
the more authentically Jewish you must be. Surely that is the way to judge who is really Jewish.
Yeah, but I'm saying in the democracy that's not accurately to what's going on, because the majority of genetically similar Jews are rejecting the religious definitions. I mean, if you want to give the British comparison, where you have your, maybe your Anglican church, the people who follow the Queen, or some old bastions of what it meant to be British, versus a new kind of secular atheist Brit that doesn't care about the Queen, doesn't care about the church, although they genetically might be basically the same. They've made a divergence in the way of life. However, they haven't intermarried away to the point where they're genetically basically the same.
Well, yes. I mean, you seem to be saying, or agreeing with me anyway, that the West, Jew and Gentile, is suffering from a collective identity crisis, and they don't know who they are anymore, and it's they find it very disorientating and disturbing and confusing, and frightening. And that's why it seems that politics seems to be divided in a 50-50 way, with Trump supporters and anti-Trump, and the people who hate Trump, Brexiteers and Remainers, and your situation in Israel. So, it seems to signify something. anyway. And particularly the fact that people don't know what their principles are, and that is what is causing this identity crisis.
Okay, people are telling me, let me see if I can figure this out. So if people in the chat are telling me my microphone is very um, low, so let me try this one. Is this better now? So I just changed the setting, so I hope um, this is my first time using StreamYard, so I just changed the setting on that. So if that made a difference and people are listening in the chat
It
could...
sounded better before to me, but then I think I'm listening to you in StreamYard, and everyone else is listening to you.
Okay, yeah, hopefully I just changed the setting, so thanks for
I can see you.
mentioning that. Hopefully that solved the issue. So I think what I'm getting at in the group strategy in terms of principles where you have your form determines function of your genetic determinist who would say your principles are basically determined by your genetics versus say maybe Claire's like a religious subscription type person. We're saying okay, your choice of religion is basically the determination of your principles, like a civic nationalist where anybody who subscribes to this religion and submits themselves to the religion, then their principles will be determined from the religion. And what I'm getting at with the Israeli Jews, American Jews, possibly Brits, where you have these divergent groups of the same genetic people where they've taken a different strategy. So certainly American Jews and Israeli Jews, the majority of us, the one thing they know is they don't really like our historic religion. They don't want our historic religion to be the determinative strategy moving forward. The things like Freud and modern philosophy and the benefits of the Enlightenment. Your vast majority of American Jews and Israeli Jews much prefer that over historically the religion, and the statistics are obvious. It's not even close. Like in the Israeli elections, the number, it's never more than 15% of Israeli Jews that favor having religious control over them. And in American Jews, like the Orthodox have never been more than 10%. Certain localities, maybe the Orthodox are as high as 20%. But it's almost universal among the mass of American Jews that we do not want the religion to be our principles. We want other things to be our principles. And
You're
it's almost
rejecting.
definitely the same in England also, where the vast majority of Jews in England have a different group strategy than historically the religion is. And, it's almost
So
universal.
you're saying Jews are rejecting their religion, but I think that is the problem. I think
Well, I'm
that
saying it's not Jews are rejecting. Jews rejected generations ago. So it's not just like, okay, the
okay, so,
Jews...
so they shouldn't be able to call themselves Jews because actually the Torah says only observant Jews are allowed to live. The ones who break the Sabbath and pick up sticks on Sabbath day are to be stoned outside the city gates.
Yeah, but then
Isn't
that's
that really
irrelevant to
the
if the
principle?
Jews have changed the definition of what it means to be a Jew, and they don't want to use the holy books and texts or scriptures or prophets to define them, and saying that's already happened generationally ago. That if you look at in America, you have APAC, which is the American Israel Political Action Committee, and it's made up of about 50 organizations of the Conference of Major Jewish Organizations, and only like five of those are Orthodox organizations, and so the vast majority of member groups in APAC do not self-define based on the religion. So you could have a minority person like Claire who's like, I demand that Jews define themselves based on the
But
text.
aren't you guilty of the ad populum fallacy, Doovid? Just to say that because more Jews are unobservant than they are observant, then we should follow the majority simply because they are the majority, even though they are in fact, rejecting the religion that made Jews what they are.
Well, I mean, it could be. I mean, the ad populum is. I mean, it could be you're right in that, but at a certain extent, like, well, so what? The majority of Jews are violating their principles, and they're still calling themselves Jews, and the majority of the world kind of is like, yeah, you
But I
guys
think
are
that's the
basically
problem,
Jews.
isn't it? That is what it is in fact causing rising anti-Semitism, because
And
when
that's just a stipulation. You're saying that if all the Jews returned and became Orthodox, that I mean, certainly in America, it's probably the opposite. Saying that the more Orthodox Jews are, the more likely there is to be anti-Semitism. And certainly that's a matter of debate of connecting secularism with anti-Semitism, or trying to. I mean, we could talk about anti-Semitism, and it might be an interesting cause. I just want to make the point, like you're saying, there's a contradiction there because you have a historical definition, or at least a scriptural definition of Jews, and even though the majority of Jews and Jewish organizations, that's not how we define ourselves, but you're going to insist that this definition, even if every single Jew disagrees with Claire, you're going to stick and say, I will define Jews the way the Bible does. I do not care even if every single Jew in the world disagrees.
Yeah, because you have to go back to scripture if you want to find the principles of your religion. I mean, where else can you find them?
But I say we're not talking religion, we're talking a group of people. So if the group of people,
But a group of people are defined by their religion. Jews are defined by Judaism, surely.
well, I'm saying Jews are a race ethnicity. Jews, I mean, if you accept the biblical story that Jews are the descendants of Jacob, regardless of whether they follow the laws of Moses or not, that saying okay, there was a man Jacob, and he had 12 sons, and those 12 sons make up the tribes of Israel, and the descendants of those people today are what we refer to as Jews. And then at the same time, you have Moses, the prophet, and the laws of Moses, that you're referring to the religion Judaism. And there's always been these two separate factors: the nation of Israel and the religion of Israel. But I mean, you could talk about any people. You say that what makes a Brit, if historically a Brit was common ancestry, and then at some point there was, being a Brit was an acceptance of Magna Carta, of a royal family, of a certain church, or whatever. If you look at Christianity, for example, that Christianity became the defining group membership of many European nations, and that's been the
But no
group.
longer now.
So
So I
what
suppose
holds
really
them together at the same time? The
would
same
be
argument.
citizenship and nationality.
What you're saying. So being a Brit is basically being Christian.
Well, not anymore, because many white indigenous people of Britain don't identify as Christian.
So
Um,
what?
so,
But
so
why
it's
should
all
Jews be different? Why can't Jews?
because Jews are defined their by their religion.
No, I mean Jews are an ethnicity. Jews. I mean, one thing, Jew is a geographic determinative. Jew referring to the land of Judea. Jews are the people that lived. That's how the Greeks and Romans referred to the people who lived in the land of Judea, hence the name Jew. And even in Europe, the name Jew was referring to the people who came from the land of Judea. So it was more a regional geographic tribal identity. I mean, just the fact that we're using the word Jew is somewhat proof that you're incorrect, because Jew is not a religious indicator; it's a geographic
Because you
indicator.
have it both ways. That is, yet another problem with Jews, because on the one hand they define themselves as a religious group, and also as an ethnicity. So they have the double protection that gives them the best of both worlds, and gives them twice the legal protection that other groups who only define themselves as um, one thing have. And I think that is probably part of the problem. And also, if you are a tribe, then there is the assumption that you can't let anybody who call themselves a Jew, but particularly if they're not. And I remember you having this discussion with OV a few days ago, and he was saying, I'm practically a Jew, aren't I? Because I have 2% Jewish blood. And you were saying, no, 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 OV, you can't have it. And, because there are certain rules about who may call themselves Jews, and what the conditions are, and he didn't satisfy them. And so you use these principles to include and exclude people, and you were excluding him because he wasn't halakhically Jewish, and then there was this discussion about who's a Mishling and whether Mishlings are considered Jews, and then it becomes very complicated. And there should be just one rule, and universally imposed all over the world. But clearly, that is not the case, because I think Israel itself is confused about whom they wish to admit as Jews or not, because apparently certain rabbis have been blacklisted. So whoever these rabbis call Jews will not be accepted by the Israeli government when their congregation who've been declared Jewish come over to Israel and want to get married there, and then they'll find them the Israeli government saying no, 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 you're not properly a Jew, go home, and that sort of thing.
Yeah, because identities are very complicated. There is no simple answer to make identity simple. And now that you have a state of Israel and you have the law of the right of return, a Jew is a immigration status where if you're legally a Jew, you have the right of return. And if you're not a Jew, you do not have a right of return. It'd be like illegal immigration. That if
Mm.
you falsely declare yourself a Jew and then try to go to Israel and it turns out you're not a Jew, you're an illegal immigrant, right?
Yeah, so I suppose
So it's like
I
you
wanted to
thought
raise
about
this
converting
next.
Orthodox, but if you didn't make the cut and couldn't find a recognized Haredi rabbi who would convert you to Judaism, and but you chose to say yes, I'm still a Jew, even though the rabbi didn't recognize it, and then you went to Israel, you would be an illegal immigrant.
Yeah, and I suppose a lot of people aren't really sure. I mean, I've heard an ultra Orthodox rabbi saying that there are lots of people who think they're Jews, but in fact are not, and there are lots of people who don't think they're Jews, but in fact are Jews. So um, this is obviously a terrible thing. People not knowing who or what they are, and this will have a knock-on effect on their lives and how they choose to lead it, wouldn't it?
Yeah,
So,
that's why the generic scientific consensus is that race is a construct, that there is no way to accurately define these things.
well, I suppose there is a rule of thumb in that, you are, for example, a German national if you present papers at German border control and you're allowed in. And when you are in, you are accepted or identified as German or could pass for German, and that sort of thing. It's not enough to say, oh, my ancestors were German, but I am American, and but I'll laugh as a German, for example.
Yeah, but we've had these discussions like Gandalf and you in Britain. If I'm looking at it as divergent group strategies, and one thing in the principles, like in the Avos, the Hebrew says, Hillel Hoya Oimer, that he was as he says in the expressions of the rabbis. It doesn't say like he says. The actual Hebrew expression was he was as he said, meaning he lived as he preached. He didn't. I think Church of Entropy played this clip of me and Brundlefly on the Babscast where I was mentioning why I heard from my rabbis the famous story about Bertrand Russell, who I think he was originally British but moved to the U.S. and God forbid, got caught up in some sort of sexual scandal, and he was this famous professor of ethics, and people called him out, and he's like, how is this possible? This famous professor of ethics is acting so unethically, and he said, does a professor of geometry have to be a triangle? And saying, okay, he's a professor of ethics, but it means he teaches ethics. It doesn't mean he has to be an ethical person. But so the Hebrew sages say no, a person has to exemplify the teachings they put forward. So to say, yes, the geometry teacher does have to be a triangle. If you're teaching ethics, you do have to be ethical. So the Hebrew expression in the ethics of the fathers, the person was as they were. There wasn't an inconsistency between what they preached and what they practiced.
Um, I don't know if you're familiar with the ideas of Heidegger and his idea of living authentically.
Yeah, I even took a course in Stony Brook on Heidegger and Derrida. So I read multiple books of Heidegger, and I'm it's complicated, but yeah, I'm familiar with that.
Well, he was talking about living authentically, and it made me think about, well, if you were born Jewish, how do you live authentically? Do you um, do you obey your religious, the principles of the religion you were born as, or do you think, well, this isn't what I like, I'm going to assimilate? And I suppose really it is a matter for the individual, but I suppose even for individuals, they might hesitate in that they might fear to offend and disappoint their parents and their community by marrying out. So it could present a dilemma to somebody who is in two minds about remaining Jewish or assimilating. And I suppose if they think they can have the best of both worlds, they will try to have the best of both worlds. But that there may be a price to be paid when you say you are two things when you are neither one properly nor the other properly.
Well, it's like the question of identity, nationalism, and citizenship. Like after the trend of Western societies to move to multicultural, certainly London, where you are, America, like New Zealand after the shooting, where the prime minister said, to the Muslims, "You are us," and the shooter or the ideas he representative of, so to say, white nationalism is not us, and sort of saying, what does it mean to be British? And you're saying, Claire, you are us, you are British. The mayor of London is a Muslim, and all of these various multicultural people that have came to London and came to Britain and gained citizenship, versus the people that ethnically have a pure, so pure ethnicity, but don't represent the values of the current regime. And saying, even though they're not us, and you had the arguments like Gandalf, like connection between language, if he's relatively pure Germanic blood, although he doesn't have German citizenship, and he doesn't speak the language, or maybe know much about the customs, and that you have that divergent group identity. So if the majority of the nation is you have the split, like in the U.S. with Trump, and where you have the multicultural diversity people, where us is this conglomerate of this new civic multicultural nationalism, versus the people who have not accepted the multicultural new nation, and they've taken divergent strategies. But there's certainly enough white people among the multicultural group that you could marry a fellow white and continue to have millions, tens of millions of white people who live in a multicultural world, and then you have the ones that interbreed, and contradictions are no longer contradictions in the multicultural world. It's like,
I think what we're trying to say here is that people are unhappy. They're unhappy with their lack of a coherent identity that they're proud of, and that's why people like Gandalf reject their American identity and want to be German. Because they obviously find, um, well, they don't like their current white American identity. And they feel that if they use their European ancestry, it makes them somehow more authentic, or higher status, or something of that nature. But
also the nature, like what
symptomatic of a deep neurosis and unhappiness about their current identity, which can only be solved politically.
if you go back to Israel, the major issue in Israeli elections is mandatory military service, and the exemption that ultra Orthodox people have to not have to serve in the army. And Netanyahu has consistently allowed this exemption to go on, even though close to 80% of Israeli Jewish citizens, that's probably the single largest consensus issue in Israel, is that they want to end the exemption to the military for ultra Orthodox Jews. And the ultra Orthodox Jews, besides for different considerations, say that they would have to violate their religion to serve in the army. So it
How would
becomes,
it violate their religion to serve in the army?
well, a person wouldn't be able to fulfill the religious dictates or mandates uh, incumbent upon a person while serving in the army. and plus it could be a contradiction of religion in the first place, as serving in the Israeli army, that even if they could do it and fulfill all the special mandates that religion puts upon himself, that it's actually a contradiction in the religion itself to serve in the Israeli army. But I mean, you talk about consensus issues, so you have the harmonizing effect of serving your state that creates Israeli citizenship today. So largely you have, versus the American Jew, the Israeli Jew has an identity based upon national military service, as opposed to the Haredi Jew, who has an identity based on the religion. However, the Haredi is a minority identity in the state, and the state is saying that the Haredim are actually the biggest problem to the state because they fail to meet the one incumbent mandate that basically creates what is an Israeli.
But surely neither the Torah nor the Talmud exempts Jews from military service.
Well, that's a matter for the scholars, but according to the vast majority of the religious, they fundamentally say that joining the Israeli army is a violation of the religion.
Mm-hmm.
So you're saying so I mean, the Israeli state is I mean, there are some rabbis like, okay, maybe the former chief rabbi of England, I forget what his name is slipping me,
Sachs.
the one you're always quoting from.
Rabbi Sachs.
Yeah, Rabbi Sachs. I even have a few books of his, but yeah, I mean, Rabbi Sachs is from a minority Orthodox position that supports military service for Orthodoxy. But in London, the majority of Orthodox Jews in Golders Green and Stamford Hill and Gateshead, or the various communities, are in disagreement with Rabbi Sachs and would say that serving in the Israeli military is a direct contradiction in violation of Jewish religious principles.
Well, I find that puzzling because obviously when Jews were living in Israel, they had armies and fought wars. So why are these Haredi Jews saying it's against our principles? Surely God would want any nation to be defended.
There are laws in the Bible about a military, and there are Israeli rabbis, and I mean, you go over the verses in Samuel where they make a king, where the Jewish people request to have a king so they could be like other nations, and then the prophet says God's words to the nation that you don't want a king because the king will do certain things, in that, but essentially having an army and having a state is copying the nations, so that even in ancient Israel, where the Jews had a nation, they had a kingdom, and they had an army, that was not Jewish principle. That was the principle of the nations copied to Israel.
So if you ask the Haredi what they really wanted, they would go back to a time of what judges. So how were things supposed to work then before the Jews voted to have a king? So how did they organize their affairs and settle matters? I mean, how were they governed before they had a king?
Well, I mean, Joshua had armies. I mean, it's a complicated issue. And so, I mean, you're going to try to be a rabbi and decipher what's the correct interpretation of the Bible. It's probably not the right venue for this stream.
Okay.
But I mean, it's consensus opinion among Haredi Jews that it's a contradiction. Rabbi Sachs is what's called a modern Orthodox Jew. Modern Orthodoxy generally represents about 10% of Orthodoxy. So at the same time, where Orthodoxy represents about 10% of Judaism, modern Orthodoxy represents about 10% of Orthodoxy, and that would be the school that would try to be like, yes, you could have a state that's religious. Yes, you could serve in the army and be a religious Jew. But the consensus of rabbis around the world disagree with that opinion.
Mhm.
Yeah, I don't think. I mean, we're going to solve that on the stream by like
No, no,
analyzing
no. I was
analyzing
just
biblical
curious
verses.
about how Jews ran
In
their
fact, I mean,
before they
the
voted for.
rabbis in Israel have ruled that it's better to die as a martyr than to serve in the Israeli army. That's been the ruling for almost 70 years. They're saying not only serving in the Israeli army is basically as bad as idol worship in that sense.
Really?
If a person, yeah, this has always been the position of the ultra orthodox in Israel. That's hence the standstill in the coalition. And this goes back to the founding of the state when the first rabbis are there and they tried to forcibly induct them. And the rabbis ruled that you should give up your life rather than serve in the Israeli army. That serving in the Israeli army is, so to say, just as bad as converting to Christianity. It would be better to be killed as a martyr than to
Do
violate.
you know why that they're so against becoming soldiers?
There's multiple different. You could consider it a form of idol worship. That the state is like an idol. You could there's multiple different reasons why it's been deemed so strict according to the ultra orthodox rabbis. Um, if you want the simple explanation of the state is like an idol, or you just say it's an unjust war, or multiple reasons. But I mean, you could look it up. I mean,
Okay,
Rabbi
I
Sachs
will.
is not representative of. I mean, you've met the Notori Karta rabbis, but even if you just walk the streets in Stanford Hill and asked your average Jew on the street there, um, that's basically consensus opinion.
Okay.
And they have units of ultra Orthodox Jews, and they've had somewhat of a train. But I mean, that's basically why Israel is at the standstill right now. And the question: what does it mean to have a Jewish state? What does it mean to have a secular Jewish state? And is it even worse to serve? Like to be in the American army, according to the ultra Orthodox, is not as bad as being in the Israeli army, because if you're in the British army as an Orthodox Jew, it's not heretical because you may not want to do it. It may not be the best case scenario, but when you're serving a false Jewish state, that's a form of heresy. That'd be better to die as a martyr than to you conduct that form of heresy.
Okay.
So I mean, these are complicated issues of identity, and
And principles.
what do you do with the group divergent strategy? So I mentioned the Haredi Jews, like Yair Lapid. They put a letter where a group of Orthodox Jews were praying at like Yair Lapid's grandfather, who was a Hasidic Rebbe. So you say like Yair Lapid and a Haredi Jew basically have, even Benny Gantz, the exact same DNA. They haven't intermarried because Israel, as a Jewish state, intermarriage is relatively low. Jews marrying non-Jews is like 5%, and intermarriage between Sephardic Mizrahi Jews and Ashkenazi Jews is still reasonably high, like 30%. But you have the vast majority of Ashkenazic Jews in Israel who marry fellow Ashkenazic Jews. So the bloodlines of your people like Netanyahu, Benny Gantz, Yair Lapid, um, the majority of your big name politician is the exact same bloodline as the ultra Orthodox Jews that reject the state.
So then you can only define yourself by your observance, and the Torah is quite clear about it. That it seems to be saying that
How would you define
God will not
Netanyahu, though?
suffer to have any observant Jews in Israel, because they're to be taken out of the city gates and stoned.
Yeah, but I mean, certainly. So you're going to say that General Benny Gantz, God forbid, should be stoned. Saying when he's the general of the Jewish army, he's the head of the party that has the most seats right now in the parliament. So you, Claire Khaw, are saying that General Benny Gantz, the most high-ranking general in Israel, who is now the head of the biggest party in parliament, should be taken outside of the gates and stoned.
Well, of course not, because he wasn't aware of this penalty.
Of
But
course, he's aware of the penalty. He's the head of Israel.
but he's not
He's
enforced.
not like you think he never picked up the Bible. You think he
No,
doesn't know.
I'm sure he knows, but he didn't expect it to be enforced. And I'm saying that there was a reason for this particular rule, which is to kind of keep standards up of who is allowed to call himself a Jew, and those who don't kind of leave their community and don't return to it.
Yeah,
And
but
for
obviously that's not the case. Where you have the head
a
of Israel,
Jews would be perfect for this purpose.
you're not arguing with a secular Jew in London who became Reform generations ago and maybe intermarried or a liberal Jew in London. You're arguing with a general of the Israeli army who's now the head of the largest party in parliament.
Well, but then I would also say that Israel ought to be a theocracy, and these are all is all wrong, and that's why you're getting all your problems of just being neither fish nor fowl.
So you're saying, but I'm saying you have too much of a divergence. So you're saying they should put the Haredim in charge of Israel.
No, I'm just saying that they should rethink the whole thing, because part of all these problems that keep popping up and having these elections again and again, because it's so evenly balanced, that there's obviously something wrong in the bigger picture, that you all can't agree on anything, and you'll be forever deadlocked in this kind of way. The way it seems that the rest of the West is, with
Yeah, you have diverging
half in and half out of the EU, and well, nothing much is happening in America, even though they, a lot of the alt-right thought they had their first alt-right president.
Well, I was saying you have divergent group strategies. So if you took it like to America, in the divide between your large base of democratic secular American Jews and Orthodox. So you're just saying, I only consider the 10% of American Jews who are Orthodox Jews, and to hell with the rest of the 90% of the Jews who reject Orthodoxy. I mean, is that what you're saying? Then what happens?
Yeah, because I don't, Reform Judaism is really updating the Torah. I mean, I
So
think.
what happens to the? I mean, I don't know the numbers in London, in England. It's probably only a few 100,000. But what happens to the majority of Jews that you say, from now on, the 5 million Jews in America that are not Orthodox can no longer call themselves Jews? What happens to them?
Well, I am reminded of this process called Haredim, which Spinoza and Trotsky were subject to. It's basically a kind of excommunication for heresy and doing things that brought the Jews into disrepute, and they were basically kicked out and declared an ex-Jew and to be shunned by all
So
Jews.
what happens to? What happens? Where do they go? What happens? I mean, so in Israel, what happens?
Are no longer Jews. It's a kind of process similar to what I propose of being struck off the register of Jews.
Yeah, I mean, so basically that's what's happened in Israel, but those people control Israel. So if you're looking, those people who have been strucken off of Judaism because they failed to follow their own religion, that there's so many more of them than those who actually follow their religion, that they have taken over the state, and now Israel is defined by them because there's such a vast majority of them,
isn't it?
Were you saying what they have to be like? So you're saying democracy is the problem? They
Yes.
should be. I mean, they can't be deported. I mean, who's going to take all of these secular Jews that no longer want to be Jews? You're saying like force. You can't even get the Palestinians, another country, to accept the Palestinians. Where you going to get who's going to accept all these Jews who don't want to be Jews anymore? Or are you just saying that to the end of democracy, we're just going to put the Haredim in charge, and these people will suffer under the rule of the Haredim?
Well, I'm sure something can be resolved under, in a theocracy, and there would be, things. I think that's a problem. This democracy thing with all.
You just want to drive into Golders Green.
It's not working for anyone, not even for Jews.
You just want to drive into Golders Green, walk up to one of your Orthodox synagogues, pick up a rabbi, and drop him off in your secular Jewish part of town, and install him as the leader there.
No, but I mean, obviously Jews need to, have a think about how they've been, running themselves. And obviously, something's wrong if most Jews don't even want to be Jews, in the sense that they don't want to follow their religion, because surely it is the religion of the Jews that gives them their, ancient lineage and their sense of identity. And if Jews themselves reject their own religion, then I guess they won't be around much longer.
Well, obviously, you're incorrect. I mean, if you're referring to British Jews or American Jews that could possibly assimilate into, being a goy, which seems to be inaccurate because you see, God forbid, the rise of anti-Semitism and group identity, and people saying, well, Jews, they're not really white, they're not really European, there's something else. And then you see in Israel that, in fact, you're absolutely incorrect because Jews have forged a new identity, and the new identity that these groups have forged are, in fact, the majority of Jews.
Yeah, but if they're all doing the wrong thing as far as uh, God is concerned, if you um,
You think
accept
it was a mistake for the
existence,
Brits to
then
become
I think bad
Christian?
stuff is going to happen.
You think it was a mistake for the Brits to become Christian in the first place? Like
Uh,
1500 years ago when the British people became Christian, that historically that was a mistake, and the British people should not have joined what you call this false religion, Christianity.
well, now that they know that they're idolatrous, and perhaps they should repent. And obviously, they most of them don't believe in their religion anyway. They're only culturally Christian in the sense that they go to church for baptisms, marriages, and funerals, but they don't. They're not believing Christians. They don't even know that they're supposed to believe in the Trinity.
Yeah, but
So
in 1500 years of that being their identity, it's very difficult to forge ahead a new, so you have, Gandalf and QST or Church of Entropy, or, some, Richard Dawkins or whoever trying to forge ahead this new secular British identity that is also ethnically homogenous. It's very difficult. So
yes,
multiculturalism is relatively easier in saying that if Christianity was a mistake and that cohesively held their society together, and now they form a multicultural civic nationalist state where ethnicity is basically meaningless, that seems to be the natural direction of these post-Christian countries is multiculturalism, multi-ethnicity.
well, I think secular Koranism would be just the thing for them.
Well,
So they'd
secular
have a
Koranism
one-party
would,
state, so they'd have more stable government, and restore the patriarchy, which is quite important for marriage and family values, and in this way restabilize their broken and atomized societies.
secular Koranism would likely speed up immigration from Arab and Middle Eastern
Well, I don't
countries
see why. Why
because those
do you
people
think?
are already acclimated to living under Quranic law. So the people who lived under Christianity and have been opposed to Islamic law are going to take a much longer time to adapt. So if you had secular Quranism, it would just likely open the floodgates to more and more um, Arab,
I don't see that
Middle
Muslim
Eastern,
countries
Islamic
are very
immigration.
I don't see that Muslim countries are very liberal about letting just anyone come into their country. I mean, I don't know this for a fact, but I think you just get more rational government under a patriarchy, because then men would think, well, we know we don't like it, but if they're kind of women in charge, women don't feel in the same way about immigration the way men do, and men are more likely to feel that their interests are threatened by uncontrolled immigration. Well, women, maybe being protected, don't seem to care, or care or realize the dangers of cultural disintegration and yeah social dislocation.
I've never seen such a thing. I mean, I could think among Hindus. I've never seen such a thing among Muslims, but like among Hindus, you have European body converts to Hinduism, and then they'll open up a temple, and after a period of years, the temple will become majority Indian, and because you might have had the original converts might have had the intention of converting masses of Westerners and having a largely Western temple of Westerners practicing a form of Hinduism, but in practicality, um, it's very difficult to change so dramatically like that. And what happens is that new Indian migrants, over a period of years, sometimes only years, tens of years, will take over, and then eventually the temple will be majority Indian. So I
Mm.
don't know, like in Islam, I've never even seen, like, I mean, there's handful of white body converts at some of the local mosques. I've never even seen like a temple like there. I know a Bosnian imam. He's even on my YouTube page. That is trying to open up a mosque for Bosnian Muslims, but I presume that his Bosnian mosque will probably be majority Arab because the population, at least in Metro Detroit, of Bosnian Muslims is relatively small, and it's hard to change styles of life. So once you have a mosque that's following these practices, it's very easy for new immigrants, people who grow up with that lifestyle, to just pop in and then demographically eventually replace it. That's what's happened to almost like Bhaktivedanta George Harrison donated the Hare Krishna temple in England, and when he first donated it, it was majority white body converts to the Hare Krishna religion. But if you go there now, it's almost all Indian people because just natural tendencies. So I don't see how secular Koranism would produce a different result from that.
Secular Koranism is not about building places of worship. It's just a legal system. I think a lot of people fail to understand that there will be no mosque of secular Koranism or anything like that. It's basically a legal system that allows freedom of worship. People just have to obey the laws. So,
yeah, I was saying that people who are naturally already in tune with a legal system like that, just like trying to impose or bring secular Western liberal democracy to the Middle East or to the East, largely fails. So in the same way, if you were successful at implementing secular Koranism in London,
and in practice, in practice,
a guy like Jay
go to their usual places of worship. So if you're a Jew, you'd be going to synagogue and church and temple and whatever. So it wouldn't change.
But you're saying that people of the area would constantly be getting in trouble with the law and having a hard time adapting, as
What
where new immigrants who are used to that style of life would have a very easy time fitting in. So it would just facilitate and increase the speed of demographic replacement.
I just don't see why you think after secular Koranism, more people would vote for more immigration. I think even non-white people in the West are actually uneasy about it.
I'm saying because it wouldn't be an easy transition for your average person that's 1,500 years of their family living under Christianity and secular liberalism,
Churches,
and feminisms and things like that. They would have a hard time adapting, as opposed to new immigrants who've lived very close lifestyles in their home countries would very quickly be able to adapt.
Well, obviously there's going to be, inconvenience and people would have to adapt. Yes, but I mean, if nobody likes my idea, I guess it's never going to happen. But if it does happen, of course, a few people will be inconvenienced and disappointed and dismayed even. But that's what it takes to, put things right. If you want to, renovate your home, you might have to put up with a bit of dust and builders banging around, but eventually the results will hopefully be worth it.
So it goes back to what we opened this stream with what happens with a person who contradicts their principles. It's like adultery or something like that. I mean, so in Moses and in Quran, you have the death penalty for a lot of things where you're saying like this contradiction is too strong and you could no longer go around as a walking contradiction. So if it's a Sabbath violator, if you're a Jew and a Sabbath violator, God forbid we can't have Jewish Sabbath violators going around, so we have to put them to death, God forbid, in order to avoid the contradiction. It's like adultery, where if the penalty for adultery is death, but that's not the current law. And so what happens to the people?
Introduce it. It's only 100 lashes. It doesn't mean death, and idolatry doesn't mean death either, because there is no specific punishment for it. in the Quran. So the Quran
Well,
is.
in Moses there is. It's adultery is punishable
Yeah,
by
yeah,
death.
but that would only be a problem in Israel, where Jews would be inflicting this punishment on each other, were they minded to do so. But for the rest of the Gentile world, it just doesn't apply to them.
But I mean, we don't, because you're saying what? Okay, so you're like, Doovid, you are blatantly contradicting yourself. You can't be a Hasidic Jew and worship idols at the same time.
But if
But
you
yet,
live in
but
so
yet I do. I've been
stone.
doing it for 10 years. Like, so what? So Claire is saying you should be put to death, Doovid.
No, 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 because you're not in Israel, and
But
Jews
if I was
are
in, you should be
not
put to.
in America. So it wouldn't apply to you because you live in a Gentile nation.
Well, say let's say
But when you live in
let's
Israel,
say
you'd
well, I'm
be
saying you have Hare Krishnas in Israel also. You have a lot of Hindus in Israel also. They're not putting them to death.
okay, but I suppose
I mean, the point is, what happens when a person violates the principles, and so generally,
it's a matter of law then. It's a matter of law and politics.
well, I mean,
What
so generally, now nothing happens. Like
yeah,
a person commits adultery, it's
but that's why you
possibly
did it, because you knew
grounds for
that would happen
divorce.
to you.
If a Jew commits idolatry, like it might be, lose respect in the community, but nothing happens to a person when they violate their principles.
No, and nothing should happen to a Jew living in the Gentile nation of America. But perhaps if Israel became a Torah theocracy, then things would be different. But if they just adopted secular Koranism there, and it would still technically be a theocracy, then nobody's going to be stoned to death, even in Israel.
Yeah, I mean, so
Which
certainly there's no appetite.
theocracy you adopt.
There's no appetite among the majority of the Israeli people for anything like what you're saying, or
I
even.
understand. I understand because I think most people prefer to be liberal. I mean that's why there are more liberal Jews and there are observant Jews and there are more liberal Gentiles than there are conservative Gentiles because it's harder to be observant. It's harder to stick to the rules. So everybody kind of lets their hair down and everything, hang out and do whatever they like, and then they get all their problems and their loss of identity and being upset about uncontrolled immigration. And I'm just suggesting that, the way to fix their problems is to, find out what the rules should be and stick to them.
Well, I
And
mean, if you look in the absolute Mosaic sense, you're saying actually tolerance is much more difficult because in the pure Mosaic law, they say if a person commits adultery, a person commits idolatry, if a person violates Sabbath, and that they're put to death, and then it's no longer a worry. The person broke the rules of society, and they were put to death, and they're no longer part of society, and people could just move on and saying that's what happens when you break the rules, as opposed to the current society way of tolerance, where the person, God forbid, a person commits adultery, and then you still have to live with that person as your mate, or the person violates Sabbath, and they're still a member of your synagogue, part of your community, or a person
yeah,
commits
because
idolatry, and you have to be tolerant of them. You can't even oust them. You can't even shun them. You say you have to accept homosexuality and all these things. Like, it's actually, tolerance is much more difficult than what you're talking about.
but yeah, in a way you say, okay, don't obey the rules, but tolerate everyone who breaks it, and then you think, well, what's the point of having those rules? If anybody in practices breaks the Ten Commandments, that there will be a problem, wouldn't there?
Well, I mean, so generally in the liberalized West, at least in the multicultural left side, you have these overarching principles of tolerance and anti-racism.
Should we tolerate evil, though? Should we
Well, you
tolerate?
still have laws against murder and stealing and stuff like that. But when you're talking
But,
about,
but you have all these social problems, and people are just getting, angrier and more upset, and that's just being dealt with by more censorship and denial. And
is anyone on the British left running to make murder no longer a crime, to make stealing legal?
well, the people do get away with murder in the sense that not very much happens to them. They go away, they stay in prison for a few years, and then they get released before time on good behavior. And then there is this general perception that the punishment does not fit the crime, and criminals are not punished properly. And then I guess this will embolden the criminally inclined, and there will be more crime to tolerate, and until we get to a state of chaos and disorder and the law of the jungle. I mean, do we want that?
Well, it's hard to say what people want. And saying we don't live in a perfect
Okay, so
world.
people
You have
don't
to live in
even
an
know
imperfect
what they
world, and
want.
therefore tolerances became the over guiding principle of your modern society.
Well, I don't think we should just tolerate everyone, all people breaking the rules, because that would just mean that the rule of law is breaking down. And surely what the Ten Commandments was about was it brought the rule of law, or the beginnings of the idea of the rule of law to
Yeah, I mean,
to
so Moses was.
protect us from ourselves and from our enemies.
Yeah, I mean, so from the modern sense, Moses was very draconian in that the punishment for a lot of things was just simply death and lashes. That
Yeah,
certain.
he had to make his point about idolatry, didn't he? I mean, because if he said, "Oh, Jews, it's all right for you to indulge in idolatry," then I guess you'd all start, assimilating and become idolaters and be no more.
Or even a Sabbath violation, that such a serious thing that you can't even let a single person get away with doing it. That even a single person in your midst who does these things has to be wet out through God forbid the death penalty.
Yeah, but I suppose it was to prevent, the slippery slope situation where, once you condone this little thing, that then you'll end up legalizing gay marriage and saying yay as a Jew, which is what E. Michael Jones was saying. He was saying, what's her name? Amy Dean or something. And she wrote in Tikkun Olam that gay marriage was, a success for Jews. He's always doing that, and equating Jews with liberalism. So I don't know how happy you are to be, tarred with that particular brush.
Well, that's saying as a strategy of tolerance that why should an ethnically homogenous society tolerate an ethnic minority in their midst, and why should a religiously homogenous society tolerate a religious minority in their midst? So generally, Jews have taken a strategy of tolerance because you tolerate because the larger society is willing to tolerate me. I'm willing to tolerate other things, and that's just been a pretty generic Jewish strategy that's pretty successful in the last few hundred years in the West.
But not if it actually flouts your principles, or even um, the laws of the land, because I think the Bible and the Quran have basically similar um, commandments and prohibitions, such as the Ten Commandments. I mean that's I think all the Abrahamic faiths would agree to that. So so that gives a kind of minimum standard of morality, and the no hide laws are, in my view, are motherhood and apple pie.
Yeah,
So
in the time of Spinoza, grounds for excommunications included like missing. I think it was four. I mean, you look up the exact number, but you were required to go to synagogue Sabbath morning, and if you missed a certain number of services a year, that was grounds for excommunications. You were obligated to show up to synagogue every Saturday morning, and if you miss more than like 1 out of 10, you were excommunicated. You're no longer part of the community. And then so to say, you're on your own. If the Jews had a special provision that they allowed the Jewish community to have our ghetto or our little section, and they were kicked out of the ghetto, whether they could convert to Christianity or find solace in the larger community. So Spinoza maybe had enough importance that even without the protection of the general agreement of the Jews, and where he was no longer part of that group, that he was able to successfully remain in Amsterdam as a post Jewish Jew. And I think he did actually have to convert to Christianity, as opposed to if in London you had to be under the guise of the rabbis of Golders Green or Stanford Hill, and if you fell out of the rules of what they considered being a proper Jew, and then they kicked you out of Stanford Hill, and
Mhm.
then let's say London, the greater English society says we're not going to let you join our society, we're actually going to deport you.
Hmm. Well, that's unlikely because they'd only deport you if you were an illegal immigrant. But I mean, that's a good way of keeping up standards.
But
And
what happens to these Jews who, presumably the majority, that don't want to be part of the Orthodox society, which, obviously, even in Israel, is the vast majority of Jews. So you say, okay, we'll let them just live in multicultural London. And then, so what happens to the British people if all these people who are leaving their ethnicity, are now part of multicultural London? What happens to to people like Jay?
well, Jay's neither here nor there. I mean, he calls himself Christian, but he doesn't believe in the Trinity. Um, so there's a problem when people misuse words, I suppose, and that's probably because of their conceptual confusion about the um, what being Christian really means, and this is caused by um, all these religions not following their own principles. Because you talk to quite a lot of Christians, and they don't actually even know, cultural Christians anyway, they don't even know that they're supposed to believe in the Trinity. And I guess when you tell them that that's what they're really supposed to believe in, they can't quite believe in it. So, if we could just talk briefly about Spinoza, he was expelled for the heresy and blasphemy of idolatry, wasn't he?
No, he was expelled, I believe, just for. I mean, he converted to Christianity later because of the difficulty of being a post-Jewish Jew in Amsterdam. But I mean, he was originally a Jewish heretic who just rejected the Jewish law, and
He offended against the 13 principles of Judaism.
but he only later converted to Christianity because once he was expelled from Judaism, and he needed to be part of something else. He ended up becoming part of the church, but he wasn't. He was expelled for internal Jewish heresy,
Yes, and the
Not for
nature of his
Christianity.
was idolatry, wasn't it?
I mean, he was more like Church of Entropy, like pantheism, the universe is God. He was, not a fan of Jesus Christ or the Trinity, at least in the beginning before he was expelled. But as after he was expelled, and you need a society, you need a structure, and it's unclear exactly what happened, but most people believe he converted to Christianity a few years after he was expelled.
Okay, but would you like to discuss why he was expelled? I mean, or and the nature of his heresy?
Well, his heresy was for rejecting the Torah, but I'm saying he didn't reject the Torah on behalf of Christianity. He rejected the Torah on behalf of enlightenment, on behalf of secular philosophy.
Yeah, which is pantheism, and um, um, according to the 13 principles articulated by Maimonides, the Rambam, he um, he made this category error of confusing God with his creation, because he was saying the universe is God, and I think the Orthodox Jewish view would be that God created the universe and exists outside it as pure spirit. Is that not the case, Doovid?
Yeah, I mean, that's generally the correct philosophy. I mean, so in that sense, like Church of Entropy and QST and a lot of forms of Hinduism or even modern Christian interpretations that aren't so Christ centered have this kind of yes, the earth is God, the universe is God, as opposed to a God outside of creation. I mean, you said it properly, the confusing creator and creation.
Mm. And that's kind of what Muslims say when they say Allahu Akbar. It actually means God is greater, and of course that invites the answer, the question, greater than what? And the answer is God is greater than his creation.
Yeah, and hence, I have on the Palestinian comedian Amir Zar on my channel making jokes about that. You know, we say like, okay, God forbid when a terrorist commits an act and says Allahu Akbar, but it's a common or Alhamdulillah, different forms. It makes sense in that situation that the saying that the principle of God is greater than the current material situation. So maybe that means but that could be used in any given situation. You're saying yes, there's a personal God who goes beyond creation, who created the material world, and is separate from the created world and could change the created world. Should it be God's desire?
Yes, that is, I think, the 10th principle, that he knows our hearts and minds and intervenes in human affairs through the agency of the Holy Spirit, I believe. Because he can't, be said to exist outside the universe and then cause miracles. So he sends the Holy Spirit to do
There's
stuff.
different theological understandings of how that process might work. One is that the world is constantly recreated, and as the world, every instant the world is recreated, and the world could be recreated under a different configuration, and that our prayer or good or bad deeds could affect the next reconfiguration the world will be created under, or that there'd be some sort of spiritual mechanism like an angel or a spirit that would enter the material realm and actively change it. But that's not important. The mechanism that God's way is not man's way, and whatever mechanism God uses to do that is beyond our concern. Just saying that it's incumbent upon us to believe that God has the ability and that God does that. However, God goes about doing that.
Yes, and I think, perhaps believing in this particular narrative um, gives people comfort in the sense that we were created for a reason, and we are expected to do what we want to do, but within the laws that God has given us.
Well, it goes with
We
the
shouldn't protect
Haredi.
ourselves from ourselves and from each other.
Well, I mean the Haredi rejection of the state. Saying that so to say the army doesn't actually protect us. The state doesn't actually benefit us. God benefits us, and we're following God's law and have no obligation to the state. And the status quo could be changed instantly. Should it be God's desire? So the main thing is following God's law.
Yes, but we're not really sure if God said you Jews never have to serve in the army. So I'm sure the Torah doesn't say anything of the sort, does it?
Well, the Torah does have quotes regarding them. There's military law and war laws in the army, and but the conditions under the current state of Israel, uh, certainly are not matching those, and the people controlling the army and the state today are largely irreligious people, or would not be considered righteous, that they would have a mandate on a person, and even a security concern where you say um, legitimate security concern where you would be required to fight for an unrighteous person, unrighteous state. Plus the theological concerns of saying, well, if God could just saying, okay, the Arabs, the Palestinians are not my enemy. The army is not defending me. God is defending me. And what will lead to my best defense is strict obedience to God's law, not material strength, not an army, not a state.
So you seem to be saying that these Haredi Jews are actually expressing disapproval of their secular government and saying, we don't like your military policy, we don't like a whole bunch of stuff that you do, and if we were to join, do national service, our sons will be corrupted. Oh, because of course you have
When I say it's also Maimonides' 10th
your
principle of
female
creator
soldiers.
being beyond creation. is saying that the Haredim are serving the Creator who is beyond creation, who could change creation. So, regardless of the current status of the reasons why the state feels it's necessary to mandate military service, that does not apply to Haredim who are in direct service to the Creator, who you could change creation.
And I suppose that the secular government thinks that there's probably not much point forcing these people into the army because they'll be terrible soldiers anyway.
No, no, so that's why I told 80%, like that's the single highest consensus issue in all of Israel. And only Netanyahu has made concessions consistently against the will of his own voters. Even Netanyahu's own voters want him to force the Haredim into service. So
Oh,
that's the single biggest issue that's causing the standstill in Israeli politics is forcing mandatory military service upon the Haredim.
okay.
That's the single biggest blockage in preventing a coalition moving forward. In the Yair Lapid, who teamed up with Benny Gantz, that was his main issue, was forcing the Haredim into the army. Avigdor Lieberman, who had been from the Russian head of the Russian coalition, said the only reason he refused to join Netanyahu's coalition was because Netanyahu was not moving forward on his promise to force the Haredim into the military.
Okay.
So I mean that's pretty clear. Like you could look at any breakdown of Israeli. That's the crux.
It's very reflective of the divisions in Israeli society, that there are religious people who actually think it a sin to become a soldier.
A
Because
sin so severe it's better to die as a martyr. So not just like a sin like like a minor sin, like a sin like idolatry, like a sin that like a sin like converting to Christianity.
Are they relying on any particular bit of the scripture? Do you happen to know off the top of your head, or is it
Yeah, I mean,
something?
there's multiple rulings. It goes beyond. I've discussed it in the past, but that's. I mean, you could ask your local Orthodox rabbi,
Okay.
or look it up, and maybe I'll do a separate stream, like to start quoting biblical verses or rulings.
Yeah.
And it's very contentious. Even Luke Ford seems to be taking the view that the Haredim are wrong, that they have some sort of obligation to the state to serve, even though it's a secular state, even though the state, even though, I mean, and then there's the obvious point that, generally serving the army will require a person to violate Sabbath, will not allow a person time to study Torah or to fulfill the daily prayer requirements or to eat non-kosher food, and so on and so on. Just the fact that being forced into the army, even though the army claims that it won't force people to violate religious Judaism, historically it has. There was cases last year where something happened and they forced the Haredi soldiers to eat on Yom Kippur. There's always issues where coming up in listening to women singing is actually a big issue, where they'll have these events and they'll have women singing or having a female commander. Let alone the greater theological idea of that would be the same if it was in the U.S. Army or any army, but let alone like to say it's an unjust war or it's an unjust chain of command that you can't fight for an on-rate that it means basically what you're saying, that the state of Israel are not in fact Jews. They've hijacked the name Judaism. If you listen to the Notori Karta rabbis, that's that's exactly what they say. They're falsely using the name Jew, which is basically what you're saying, that Israel, they're not really Jews, that all of the people in charge of the Israeli government have renounced their Judaism, and they should no longer be able to use the word Jew, let alone call themselves a Jewish state. And so Israel's not actually a Jewish state. I mean, according to your own logic, that's basically what you're saying, right? You're saying that Israel's not a Jewish state. Those people have renounced their Judaism and should not be able to have the privilege of calling themselves Jews. Isn't that
Well,
what you're saying?
yeah, I guess I am.
So when you say Benny Gantz and Yair Lapid, and you're saying like you are not in fact a Jew. I'm sorry.
Well, I mean, obviously,
And you're
Jews
saying Israel is
themselves
in
have
fact
to
not a
agree
Jewish
to
state.
decide. I mean, it's not for me to say, but it seems to me that according to the Torah, you're supposed to be observant, and if you're not observant, you get kicked out or stoned to death outside the city gate. So the purpose of that rule is quite clear, that God does not want unobservant Jews to call themselves Jews, or there will be trouble, and it sounds like there is in Israel because of it, of such a,
Yeah, I mean, there's actually more trouble in Israel than in America. Like when you mention like the secular Jews and Trump and the rising anti-Semitism or whatever case, the issue is much bigger in Israel than it is in America or London. Like I don't know what the current situation in London is. There might be a small increase in anti-Semitism, but I doubt um, these issues are such a big factor to your average secular Jew in London. Like the Labour Party and is Jeremy Corbyn too anti-Semitic that they have to quit the Labour Party? Isn't I mean it's a parallel to global phenomenon, but it's much more like Burko or whatever. Say, well, Burko, saying he quit the Labour Party because the Labour Party is too anti-Semitic, and to get what you're saying, well, Burko's not a Jew anyways. What
well,
does it
because
matter?
a Tory, and he was Speaker, but yeah, he might as well have been Labour because he's so left wing. But
You're saying, what does he care anyways? I mean, he's not a Jew anyways, according to what you're saying. So why does he care about anti-Semitism?
well, sorry, who are you talking about now?
Who was the British head of Parliament, the Speaker of the House that just quit a few weeks ago?
He hasn't actually quit. He's just announcing his retirement in advance. Are you talking about John Bercow, the Speaker of the Parliament?
Yeah.
Um, I don't think he has quite. He's saying. I actually can't remember. He's only announcing his retirement in advance.
But I mean, according to you, he's not a Jew anyways. But I
Um,
mean, he said he's retiring because of Jewish issues, right?
no, well, I don't know. I think it's something more political than that. So I'm not. Um, I haven't really paid that much attention to it.
But I was saying the issues that you're bringing up seem like they're a bigger factor in Israel than in America because obviously you like you've Olaf or someone in the chat referring to half Jews as Jews, or he's going to say the opposite, like Jews and ethnicity, or Jews are in opposition. Like unless you became a Christian, you still have your Jewish identity. Israel is a much bigger issue because you have non-Jews, so to say, at the head of the Jewish state, where it doesn't matter what happens, any way that the coalition breaks down, you're going to have a non-Jew as the head of Israel. There's no scenario where you're not going to have a non-Jew in charge of Israel.
Right. So you're saying that the Haredim are taking my position, basically, that they're actually denying the legitimacy of the entire state of Israel, and for that reason refusing to serve as soldiers in it.
Yeah,
Is
so I'm
that
saying it's not just like, okay, they're going to like, maybe we're not going to be able to follow our religion practically. They're saying it's a moral imperative
not
at
to
the
serve?
punishment of death to not serve in this fake Jewish state.
Wow, wow. I had no idea.
But I mean, it's basically the logic that you gave at the beginning that is their logic. And saying these people are not Jews. These people, Netanyahu, Gantz, Lapid, any of these people, they're not Jews. They're just evil men who falsely use the label Jew. And under no circumstance could you support those people falsely calling themselves Jewish.
Or die in any war started by them. Well, that's very interesting. I mean, that sounds a kind of principled behavior, but obviously interpreting it in a way that is very controversial indeed. Um, Aaron Amihod never mentioned that, or I don't remember him and his wife mentioning it. Do you listen to any of his podcasts?
No, I mean, because he would be the example of kind of like the watered down religious Jew who's saying like, no, no, I'm Orthodox, I'm still Jewish, but it's kind of
He
like,
started off Reform, and his ancestry is Christian, I believe.
but I mean, he would kind of be like the Rabbi Sachs watered down Judaism. And he's not even. I mean, like Aaron Amihud's no Lord Rabbi Jonathan Sacks,
No, I know,
but even in that, like Lord Jonathan Rabbi Sacks has watered down Judaism to what where he's saying yes, Israel is a prime example of a Jewish state, and that there's no reason at all why the ultra Orthodox people should refuse to serve in the army because Israel is representative of the precedents of Torah law where you have military and fighting for the Jewish people, or kind of like whatever modern day apologetics you get from Jonathan Sacks, you're going to have an even worse version of the apologetics from Aaron, where he was like, "Yes, Israel is." Where he's basically going to say, "Yes, Israel is a Jewish state."
right.
And you're saying, according to Claire Khaw, you're saying like, no. I mean, if a person doesn't follow Jewish law, they're not a Jew, and if so Israel's not a Jewish state if its leaders are all non-Jews.
How very interesting. It's just that I know he and his wife are political activists, but he as far as I can remember, never mentioned this big deal thing that's going on in Israel. He complains more about illegal immigration, I think.
Like he would kind of put to the side, he would say these Haredi people are extremists that don't represent Jewish values, and somehow he would have to defend the leadership of the current state of Israel. Where I mean, according to your definition, you're just saying that if you don't follow Jewish law, you can't use the word Jew, and so he would have to disagree with you on that point. Like the basic principle. How do you, if you say that you have to follow Jewish law to be a Jew, then how do you include the leaders of Israel as Jews when they clearly don't follow Jewish law?
Well, that is
I mean, you can have that for your next conversation with him.
yes, yes. I suppose the people in the chat might be a bit tired of this by now, but what a fascinating discussion.
But I'm saying I don't think saying like Lord Jonathan Rabbi Sacks like probably wouldn't get that much honor if he went to Stanford Hill. I mean, do you think? Do you
Well,
think
I think he has rather, neglected his own people. I mean, he actually
through
said,
trade-offs? That's how it happens in Israel through like through distribution of welfare. So Netanyahu was able to garner the support of the Haredim in Israel through welfare, and even now it was just in the news that the Haredim are considering teaming up with blue and white to form a coalition. That the Haredim are willing to dump Netanyahu and team up with the coalition. That one of their main things was being against the Haredim, but in order to come to power, that they might broker a deal because politics is politics. So Jonathan Sacks might have been able to do things like that in Stanford Hill, where your average person in Stanford Hill would say, like, Rabbi Sacks isn't really a rabbi. He's a politician. He might call himself rabbi, but he's not really representative of the Judaism we believe in. But at the same time, maybe he's done things like in terms of protecting the community or distribution of welfare or different community concerns that the leaders of the rabbis they do respect, will say like, okay, just let Rabbi Sacks be Rabbi Sacks and do what he does because he gets us the Gibbs.
right. So who are the Blue and White Party in Israel? What are they supposed to stand for? In
They
the
just stand
coalition.
for being against Netanyahu. They were specifically formed in the last year in order to oust Netanyahu. Yair Lapid, who was the main opposition before, his main issue, I mean, he had different issues, but his main issue was forcing the Haredim into the army. And then he joined forces with General Gantz because Israel's largely a military state, and the generals have the most respect in Israeli society. So Lapid joined force with Gantz to make the Blue and White Party, who didn't really have that much of a political platform. Their main platform was getting rid of Netanyahu.
Right.
So now
Gosh.
the Haredim might be able to step in and just be like, well, you didn't really mean that about ending the exemption for military service for the Haredim, and you don't really mind like all the charity and welfare benefits that the Haredim get, and like so we could help you oust Netanyahu, and we'll join your coalition if you just continue the exemption for us in military service and continue giving us all the state benefits, charity benefits that we've been getting because that's how politics works.
Well, perhaps Israel should have a one-party state, so they don't have to be forever fighting and having elections.
Well, that's where we start at the beginning of the issue. So who's going to be the head of the one-party state? A non-Jew, like Gantz or Lapid, or are you going to put the Haredim, even though the Haredim are the single most disliked people in all of Israel?
Well, fortunately, I don't have to solve your problems, but I think something would somehow be, with the right structure, then perhaps these problems will be ironed out. If there were an orderly way of selecting a leader. I quite favour the papal conclave rules, where they get all locked in the Sistine Chapel and vote for the person they think will be the best possible leader, and it can't be themselves. That seems to be a good way of resolving these differences in a fair and
Those are all cardinals. I'm
conducive
saying,
way.
I mean, that might work for like the rabbis if the rabbis had to choose, but like among a diverse group of people, I doubt that.
Perhaps it should be ruled by Rabbi.
Well, that's what I'm saying. The rabbis are the least popular people in all of Israel.
Yes.
I mean, it goes back to originally what I was trying to tell you about the divergence in group strategy, where you have people who are ethnically the same, genetically the same, but have chosen a different group strategy. So in the time of the Talmud, the Second Temple, you had Hillel and Shammai, who were the two major rabbis of the generation, and Hillel was more liberal, and Shammai was more strict conservative. General. There's many stories about conversion, where the convert comes to convert, and he's not serious enough, and Hillel kind of like beats him with his stick and chases him off, and then Hillel tells him, love your neighbor like yourself, and the rest is commentary, and all types of stories. There's constant debates between Hillel and Shammai, and almost consistently Shammai gives the stricter ruling and Hillel a more lenient ruling. But it says that the children of the followers of Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai were still willing to intermarry with each other. That the divergence wasn't so great that even though like Beis Hillel, the house of Hillel, was constantly more lenient than the house of Shammai, that the children of the two schools were still willing to intermarry with each other, as opposed to say like the Sadducees and the Karaites, who those Jewish movements didn't intermarry with each other, and that has basically happened in Israeli society, and it's basically happened in America, in British, certainly the Jewish society, and probably the larger Goyish society, where your Orthodox Jews do not intermarry with secular Reform or Reform Jews, and also your Goyim, who have embraced multiculturalism, do not and are anti-racist, do not intolerant, do not intermarry with the Goyim that prefer an ethnically homogenous society. That there's been a divergence in group strategy where the people no longer intermarry with each other. Do you agree with that assessment?
Yeah, I mean, when you say a divergence of group strategy, you seem to be saying a disagreement on the interpretation of the rules.
Yeah, so Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai had a difference in the interpretation of the rules, and there were all these arguments where Beis Hillel said you had to take this more strict stance,
Mhm,
and Beis Hillel said you could take a more lenient stance, and but the divergence was not so great that they refused to intermarry with each other,
mhm,
as opposed to the modern divergences where the difference is too great that you can't have intermarriage between the two groups, because you can't have a cohesive way of life. If you had a son and daughter of these different movements, they're like saying Yiddish, like nish to hin, nish to her. They're not going to be here. They're not going to be there, because
yeah,
the way of life has become too divergent. So like multicultural, if you have a person who has embraced multiculturalism and they marry someone who's anti-multiculturalism, they are not going to be able to get along in society, because which side are they going to live in, the red states or the blue states? Are they going to
yes.
have African American and Muslim friends, or are they going to not have African American Muslim friends? And so the divergence has become.
The polarization has intensified, and I guess that's a bad thing.
Well,
Now that Republicans and
well, now you're
Democrats
making a judgment
threat
call.
each other.
When I say it's a bad thing is a judgment call. We're saying, okay, is that the accurate diagnostic of the situation? So in Israel, oh, that's why I say genetically, blue and white and the Haredim and Netanyahu are genetically basically the same. They have not. They're all descended from the same Ashkenazic Jews,
Mm.
and relatively, they have not intermarried with many people outside of Ashkenazic Jewry. However, the way of
So it's
life
about
is
shared values, which obviously, these Jews do not share with each other.
yeah. So the struggle for the heart of Israel has become too deep, where you can't have a Haredi, even though Yair Lapid is a descendant of a famous rabbi. Saying Israel that whatever the case is, you can't have intermarriage now between the descendants of blue and white, the people who served in the army, and the people who refused to serve in the army.
Mhm.
It's such a controversial, divisive issue that if someone serves in the Israeli army and someone refuses to serve in the Israeli army, that you can't have a peaceful marriage that will work between the two parties
Mhm. I understand.
without one side converting to the other. It's like Aaron and Mehud.
It's like
What's going to be with his kids? They're either going to refuse to serve in the army and be Haredi, or they're going to serve in the army and be mainstream Israeli.
but he's not Haredi, is he?
Yeah, so his kids are going to have to serve in the army.
Right.
So his kids will not be able to marry a Haredi. So Aaron Amihud could not, one of his kids can't marry someone from Stanford Hill because the military service is such a divisive issue, and so ironically in Israel multiculturalism is not a divisive issue because neither side is pro multiculturalism. So in America, that's the major issue is like multiculturalism. In Israel, multiculturalism is not the major issue because neither side is multicultural.
Yes, I understand.
But so what happens with the group evolutionary strategy going forward, where you have like when Eke says something like I don't want to be ruled by someone that's not me. So he's saying like, well, in Israel, like both sides are me. Okay, Doooovid's a half Jew, but saying both sides are basically the same people. They just have a different principles, different way of living their life. And even if they don't intermarry, it's like I think there's been cases like that in Europe where you've had divisions over hundreds of years, where you had ethnically the same group that split off into two nations and remained relatively ethnically homogenous. Even and they just had different issues on way of life, not interbreeding, that caused them to split into two different societies. I don't know in China or the East or India, there's probably lots of Africa, lots of given examples where you have two different nations that are basically genetically the same people, speak the same language, largely have the majority of the same religion and customs, but there was some very divisive political issue that caused the society to fracture and make two separate nations.
I see. Mm. And you think um, political opinion is so polarized because of the developments in the West? Do you think? Do you think
Say that
that
again?
might be the reason that political opinion in Israel is so polarized because of stuff that's happening in the West?
No,
Do you
I think it's largely unrelated because you have because in the West you have these issues of immigration and multiculturalism, and in Israel that's not really one of the dividing points between the left and right. Both the left and the right are anti-multiculturalism, anti-immigration. The issue is secular or religious.
and
I
well,
mean,
I
Benny
guess
Gantz
secular
and Yair
means
Lapid do not
liberal
want
and
their.
religious means conservative.
Say it again.
Secular means liberal and religious means conservative. So in a way, it's that kind of divide, isn't it?
Yeah, saying Benny Gantz and Yair Lapid don't want multiculturalism. They want a secular leftist Israel of all Jews.
And which the religious Jews pointedly reject as being, I guess, un-Jewish. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, basic,
what's the
but I'm saying that
principles
the
that you
question
said?
isn't over The question isn't over ethnicity or race. The question is over the definition of Judaism. So he's
Yes.
saying historically, this is what Jews were like, but moving forward, this will not be what Jews are like, as opposed to the Haredim saying historically, this is what Jews are like, and moving forward, we're going to be the exact same.
Hmm. Do you have a side that you favour, Doovid?
Well, that's why Doovid has. I mean, I wanted to thank you. That's one of the major reason I decided to stream with you was because that stream at Church of Entropy where you're like, what about Doovid and his multiple truth hypothesis? So that's why Doovidism has this multiple truth hypothesis, because to me that's the only way forward. Is it has to be that there could simultaneously be opposite things that are true.
Well, such as a rule that, I mean, such as a case that rules are made to be broken and obeyed, because it's obviously true, even though they appear to contradict each other.
Yeah, yeah. There has to be multiple truths. There has to be multiple truths, and it has to be that even though these multiple truths appear to contradict, they're still truths.
But what about the principle of the excluded middle, which says you can't, it can't be both raining and not raining?
Well, I mean, saying multiple truth doesn't mean that there is no truth.
But
So
because
it might more
two
be.
situations can, simultaneously exist.
It's not saying that
It's
all
possible
truth,
for
everything's true.
true.
I'm not going straight to like complete relativism. We're saying everything is true. We're just saying that there's multiple truths, and sometimes they appear to be contradictory and are true at the same time. But I'm not nearly going as far to say that there is no.
Paradoxical.
Well, I'm not saying there's relativism, and I'm not saying everything is true or nothing is true. I'm still saying there's true. I'm
Hmm.
just saying there's multiple truths, as
Okay.
opposed to saying there's like everything is true or there's only one truth. I'm just saying there's multiple truths.
Okay.
And if you take like the physics attitude, it could be like a uh, probability wave where you have where truth is like a probability type assessment, like in terms of the material realm and where's the particle in the particles Schrodinger's equation. It's a probability curve. That truth could be some sort of probability curve, or but I mean it could also be that there's multiple absolute truths, and it could also be that like you were saying, that the creator is separate from creation. Creation and creator are not the same thing, and that's the way people like Maimonides and a lot of the philosophers of his time tried to resolve these contradictions, was saying it's only in the realm of the created that these things appear to contradict themselves, but in the realm of the creator they're not actually contradictions. And it's due to our limited ability to see the truth in the material form that the material realm is naturally a realm of opposites, either this or that. But in the spiritual realm, you'll see that that wasn't the case. It just appeared that it was either this or that, but in reality, um, they weren't contradictions at all. I mean, it's also kind of like a circular argument, because you're saying as long as we're in the material realm. Um, I mean, I think it was on your stream with I mean, you weren't very active in the conversation if you were listening with OV and spiritual. You're talking about your principles things, and we were mentioning this on your stream. I don't know if you were paying attention.
Which bit are you talking about? I mean, what particular argument are you referring to?
We're talking about principles and the absolute value of principles, and I mean, one thing we talked about at length was the essential principle of self-interest. So maybe they were giving Luke
But then
Ford
it
as
would
the
be
example.
moral. You see. I mean, we decided earlier that a principle would always be a moral principle, and a moral principle would come from religion, wouldn't it? Because that's how morality is taught to us, usually through religion.
Well, I use the expression. I mean, we'll go back to the point about the principle of self-interest, but the a
And
lot of
he
Jews.
disagreed with you, saying, well, it's not a principle if you have a principle of only benefiting yourself and promoting your own self-interest, and then you kind of started talking about Luke Ford.
Yeah, he was the example of saying, okay, Luke, saying, did Luke Ford violate his principles? And I saying, well, if his principles, Luke Ford does what's best for Luke Ford, did he, does that make explain it all, or like the ADL, saying ADL or Jewish Group Evolutionary Strategy, the Jews will do what's best for the Jews, or the ADL will do what's best for the Jews. So they might appear to contradict themselves. Like, how is it possible that the ADL will come after you if you are anti-immigration in America, and the same ADL will come after you if you attack Israel for being anti-immigration, and say, well, because the ADL is a pro-Jewish group and they're not interested in logical consistency, they're interested in promoting Judaism. So if the Jews in Israel and America are doing contradictory things, the ADL is going to attack you, not based on how logically consistent you are, but on how whether it's for the Jews or against the Jews.
But the thing is, you can think you're promoting your own interests, but end up, destroying yourself if you have no principle. For example, if you just always want to have the maximum of pleasure of property, then you might steal and kill and do all these things and get away with it for a while and then be caught and convicted and executed. So always doing what you like is probably not the best strategy for long-term survival.
Just Olaf is in the chat here saying that there's only one God, there's only one truth, and so the rabbis will use the expression I was using on your stream, the God's eye view versus the man's eye view. So truth from the perspective of man's eye is not necessarily the same as truth from God's eye, and the truth from God's eye is the ultimate truth. Truth from man's eye is not the ultimate truth. So it could appear to be a contradiction from man's eye, and I was using the example from man's eye, birth is good and death is bad. But it's possible from God's eye, you could make the argument that death is good and birth is bad.
Or that you can't have one without the other.
Well, you can say you have, yeah, I mean, if you're going to make a value call, saying, okay, but I mean, certainly you are you because you're alive, and you're alive because you took birth, and when you die, you'll no longer be you. Whether it's reincarnation or heaven or hell or the various forms of what might happen to the soul after death, whoever Claire Khaw is will no longer exist after death. So he's saying that that would appear from your perspective to be bad. But you could argue from a God's eye perspective that, like, well, actually, not only is it good for the world, it's actually good for your soul that you die.
Well, I thought the whole idea was that we all live, we all die. The significant time really is how we spend our time while we live and what kind of memory we leave behind after we are dead. And that is the Olam Abba, is it
Well,
not?
it's one of my favorite. Olam Abba just means the world to come, which could be interpreted in many ways. It could mean the future in the material realm. It could mean the future after Messiah. It could mean the future in the spiritual realm. But as mentioning the schools of Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai, the Talmud says for 2.5 years the school of Beis Hillel and Shammai argued whether it was better or not for God to have created man. And Beis Shammai held that would have been better had God never created man, and Beis Hillel said it was a good thing that God created man. And the Talmud says after 2.5 years, Beis Hillel finally agreed to Beis Shammai that it would have been better had God never created man. But they agreed that since we're here, we should try our best. We should
Make
introspect
the
and
best of things.
yeah, we should make the best of things or try to be the best people possible. But that was one of the rare occasions where Beis Hillel took had the generally the lenient side that, like, well, yeah, of course it's good that God created man, is where Beis Shammai had some sort of fatalistic, more possibly accurate view about the nature of humans, and saying, well, if I were God, I would not have created man. If you were the all powerful entity and could do whatever you want, is man what you would have created? Probably not. And so base Hillel, man, the nature of man is to be sinful and rebellious and all these various things. So after 2.5 years, base Hillel finally agrees. You're right. I don't see how it's possible. I don't understand why God created us. It doesn't make any sense why we're here. But we're here, yet we're here, so we might as well do our best.
Mm. But you could be more sort of purposive and say, well, obviously, we're alive. We have been given the choice to be good or evil, and we will deserve a better afterlife if we choose more good than evil while we're around.
Yeah, but Citizen Reporter is talking about the ADL. So I'm talking about, okay, the ADL might have negative effect on Goyim. The ADL might be logically inconsistent, but going to the self-interest rule, the ADL generally always acts on the best interest, or what they see as the best interest of Jews.
Mhm.
So if being in the not the best interest of non-Jews is in the best interest of Jews, the ADL will not care that it's not in the best interest of non-Jews. And even if it's completely hypocritical and inconsistent, the ADL will be, say, well, I don't care that we're being hypocritical and inconsistent. I'm acting in what appears to be our best interest, even though it's hypocritical and inconsistent.
Mhm.
So I'm not defending the ADL in the sense that I'm saying the ADL is right, but I'm saying that the self-interest principle, for the ADL makes sense, and you're saying that people generally do what they feel or appears to be in their self-interest. That's naturally ingrained into the human creation, the principle of self-interest. That people might make mistakes that largely based on probably short-term versus long-term planning, where most mistakes in self-interest are mistakes in long-term versus short-term planning, but people never consciously make mistakes and go against their self-interest. And there's a lot of doubt and uncertainty, because obviously you may not know what's in your self-interest. Like, obviously, if you knew what the lottery was going to be, or you knew what stocks are going to go up and down, but the future is uncertain, so knowing what's in our self-interest is unclear. I mean, it seems general that the nature of creation is that we're pre-programmed to act in our own self-interest.
Yes, but it's also that we are warned against doing certain things like gambling and sex and drugs and rock and roll and stealing, and it might be tempting to steal, to kill,
That's short-term versus long-term.
and things that give us pleasure and end up destroying ourselves.
You were saying generally that when the person does those things, it's not because they're actively acting against their own self-interest, is because they're making a mistake in short-term versus long-term interest. So
Mm.
in the short term, I want to have pleasure, and therefore I engage in sinful or harmful activity, even though the long term will take its toll of negative consequences. But it wasn't that the person actively decided to act against their self interest, they just chose short term self interest over long term self interest.
Yes, so believing in an afterlife would be um, the ultimate in terms of the postponement of pleasure. So I guess a lot of human activity is based on our beliefs. So if we believe that we'll go to heaven if we behave well, then we're more likely to behave well in this life in the expectation and hope of going to heaven. But if we believe there's only one life, then we'll think in a nihilistic, criminal way to enjoy as much pleasure as we can in this life, and do all the dangerous things that might harm us as individuals and society as a whole.
So even the martyr isn't going against their self-interest, because the martyr believes that even though it might be the end of their material life, that long term for the soul or their legacy, even ending their life in a negative situation could be what is in their best self-interest.
Yes, if they care about their olam haba.
So philosophically, like, hopefully Church of Entropy will eventually do those slides from like uh, Tversky and what was his name slipping me?
Well, we could do it now.
Well, the one cognitive bias. Okay, yeah, I was going to ask you. I don't know if you want. if anyone from the chat wants to come on. Did you have any more points on this that you wanted to cover, or did you want to see if anyone from the chat wants to come on, or did you want to look at some of these slides on cognitive bias?
Yeah, I mean, whatever. It's your show, David. I'm, happy to go along with whatever you want.
I mean, I was going to do this with Church of Entropy. I don't even
Sure.
mind. I don't even mind doing them twice because they're pretty important.
Yeah,
And
yeah, yeah. Do them.
Kahneman and Tversky is the name. And actually, this guy Tversky, his widow was on Sam Harris last week, who had these famous things about type 1 and type 2 thinking, if you've thought about that. But the concept of principles from a biological scientific terms has largely been rejected. That saying mankind does not operate on principles, and according to the biological understanding of how neuroscience works, that people just are not principled people. That's not the way the human animal works. So you're talking from a philosophical stance where a person could come up with a bunch of principles, and then based on what they thought are good moral principles, act upon them, as opposed to what biology is saying. Like, no, that's just not how man works.
Mhm. Well, obviously, but I think probably it helps us to obey a few rules. But perhaps animals have a few rules that they obey, to protect them from harm, or to get them their food or their mate or their whatever. So I think perhaps even non-human animals have rules that they feel they must follow in order to remain in existence. I mean, social animals have rules of behavior, don't they?
Okay, so is my screen share working?
Yeah.
Okay, so these are just some slides that I found going over. This is pretty well known the Kahneman Tversky as System 1 and System 2, although it's more philosophical, the neurological showing. You want to read cognitive bias?
Okay. A cognitive bias refers to the systematic pattern of deviation from norm or rationality in judgment, whereby inferences about other people and situations may be drawn in an illogical fashion. Individuals create their own subjective social reality from their perception of the input.
Okay, that was just from Wikipedia. Here's a simpler one if you want to read this one too.
A cognitive bias refers to a fast mental shortcut in thinking based on incomplete information and gut reactions that bypasses more comprehensive and systematic modes of thought. It is a function of both reason and emotion and operates whenever judgments have to be made quickly and under uncertainty.
Okay, so here's saying cognitive biases are likely an evolutionary adaptation. This is like mainstream university thinking, not theological thinking. Very useful for our pattern seeking ancestors to avoid being weeded out of the gene pool. Related to type 1 versus type 2 errors. Type 1, false positive, assuming things when they aren't there. Like here in the picture, just thinking that maybe there's a dangerous animal there. Type 2, false negative, not assuming things when they are there.
Mhm.
There's uncertainty. Is there danger there or is there not? So you have a type 1 false positive or a false negative. Either one could be bad. So in prehistoric environment, a type 2 error would be fatal. A type 1 merely a nuisance.
So the rule would be you'd err on the side of caution.
Yeah, so this is the evolutionary understanding of why people have these cognitive biases. So cognitive biases thus serve a crucial function, but they can also be very costly.
Mhm.
So here's Kahneman and Tversky. So if anyone watches Sam Harris, Tversky's widow was on the last podcast of Sam Harris. And he says there's system 1, fast, emotional, instinctive, and system 2, slow, deliberate, more logical. Examples of system 1, driving a car on an open road, Simple things like completing the phrase
Mhm.
war and Claire, war and peace, war
Yeah,
and I mean, it is just, it doesn't require thought. It's just a fast instinctual thing that the mind does automatically, like 2 + 2 = 4. System two is your more complicated, like parking in a tight spot, bracing yourself before a sprint, giving someone your phone number. Cognitive bias are mostly a result of system one, which jumps to a conclusion. So it's saying that instinctual action where you don't have to think, you just have an initial immediate reaction based on pre-training, and then system two that requires more complex thought and cognition. And cognitive biases generally happen in system one, and it's a biological aspect that you have to switch, that the natural condition is to be in system one of just quick automatic thought and so even scientists are not free from cognitive bias. Scientists are supposed to take all data into account and objectively reach a conclusion. In reality, science, especially in industry, is constantly done in the face of incomplete and uncertain data, risky and often widely uncertain, subject to tight time and funding constraints, subject to personal and emotional biases and groupthink. Okay, so I found these um, slides from someone who was specifically talking about drug discovery. But these things, difficulty thinking statistically, considering all data, difficulty of doing multi-parameter optimization, organizational deadlines in the face of uncertain data, remembering successes and discounting failures, personal biases, favorites based on experience, emotional or personal reasons. So you want to look at this first, cognitive bias correlation versus causation.
okay. Fallacy, modification, X increased log P and binding affinity. It's very hard to read. I'm afraid I'm
This
probably
is
not.
kind of mathematical. Let me see. Um,
You,
I took these from a scientific one. So I was going to do these with Church of Entropy. So these are more scientific. I mean, you have confirmation bias, which is called the most common cognitive bias. Um,
you want me to read this one? Okay. Rules and metrics for drug-like
just go to the
compounds.
bandwagon effect. I don't know. Maybe this one might be bad because these slides are all using examples of chemistry. But
Right.
confirmation bias is where you assume things to be to confirm your own bias, like the bandwagon effect. Jump on a bandwagon because of fear of missing out. Um, all mainly adapted because of bias towards successful cases and self-reinforcing groupthink. Where have you heard of confirmation bias?
When you look for things that will confirm the correctness of what you're doing, but in a biased way that makes you ignore the things that you know tell you that what you're doing is probably wrong.
Yeah, these things have
Is
been well studied and documented, where they've been tested on countless people, and shows that confirmation bias is a huge thing, and possibly the most common form of cognitive bias. Certainly in these debates, where people will give the evidence that supports what they're saying. So there might be 1,000 pieces of evidence, and maybe the majority of them go against a person's ideas, but they'll keep on giving the evidence that confirms them, even though that's the minority out there.
yeah.
So that's been demonstrated to be possibly the most common. There's another one called anchoring, and it's how you phrase the question. So they can get kind of bad examples. Um, so anchoring, like if you're thinking of weather, like who's happier, Californians or Midwesterners? So you might think California because maybe California has better weather or something. Tendency to rely too much on one piece of information, especially if it's recent, prominent, or easily available or remembered, can be influenced by mood, personality, random factors, potential sources of anchoring. Then you also have availability bias. where you're just taking the available information. So there might be all types of information out there, and only certain pieces are readily available. So you base your decision based on just what's available to you at the time, even though in reality that's not indicative of the general rule you're trying to derive. Representativeness. So here's an example. Linda's a 55-year-old woman with a family. She likes reading and quiet reflection. Ever since she was a child, Linda's been non-confrontational and in a tense situation prefers tactical retreats to open arguments. Given this information, what is Linda's likely profession? A librarian or a doctor?
Librarian.
Yeah, so is it because it's a
Because do you,
woman? Is
well,
it
well,
because it's a woman and you assume that because it's a woman, she's more likely to be a librarian or a doctor? Or is it because she likes reading and quiet reflection? Um,
well, both, probably. Well, both.
certain examples where you're just people will have a bias in representative. So you think like stereotypically. Do you want to read the last slide?
Avoiding cognitive biases. Some easier than others, but hardwired into our brains, harder to avoid biases with random or emotional components, for example, anchoring. Deliberate mental training to pay attention to negative data. Make statistical thinking a part of your routine, but test anecdotal data. Deliberately generate hypotheses that contradict yours, then ask what would happen if they were true. Avoid being wedded to rules, metrics, technology, people. Be a fox rather than a hedgehog. The fox knows many things, while the hedgehog knows one important thing. Group genius. Your biases can cancel my biases. Speak up.
Yeah, those slides were only mediocre. I apologize for church of entropy. I had another one, but for some reason, um, did you want to look at these logical fallacies that I was showing on the
Yeah,
weekend
yes,
review?
I think they're fun.
Okay. Did you want to start back with what is an argument?
What is an argument? An argument is a presentation of reasons for a particular claim. It is composed of premises. Premises are statements that express your reason or evidence. These premises must be arranged in an appropriate way in order to support your conclusion. To craft a strong argument, one must possess a certain degree of familiarity with the subject, use good premises, find good support for one's conclusion, focus only on the most relevant part of the issue, only make claims that are capable of being supported.
So, what is a fallacy?
When an argument fails in one of the previously mentioned ways, that failing is called a fallacy. Essentially, fallacies are defects in an argument. They are very common and can be quite convincing. Most of us have likely been convinced by a fallacious argument before. In fact, we've likely presented one. Types of fallacies. There are many, many fallacies, far too many for us to look at them all in this presentation. We will be examining 16 of the more common fallacies. For additional information on these fallacies and others, please visit.
Okay. So I covered the first 8 of these in Church of Entropy. We'll go through quickly. Hasty generalization, making assumptions about an entire group of people or a range of cases based on an inadequately small sample. Creates a general rule based on a single case. Stereotypes are a common example. Do you have any comment on that?
Oh yeah, I mean the example is my roommate from Maine loves
You don't have to
lobster
read
round.
the example. So if you want to give your own example or just a generic comment, I'll go on.
No, no, I think that's fairly easy to understand.
Okay. Yeah, I'll skip the examples unless you want to comment on one. So missing the point. The premise supports a conclusion. Other than the one it is meant to support.
Hmm.
Okay, so I mean, people could read the examples on their own if they want. Okay, if you got nothing to say. So post hoc, false cause. Post hoc comes from the Latin phrase post hoc ergo propter hoc, which means when translated is after this because of this. The fallacy assumes that because X precedes Y, therefore X caused Y. You may have heard of explained as correlation is not the same as causation. Superstitious beliefs are often due to the post hoc fallacy. So we've been over this. Any comment on this?
Yes, yes, you had a very interesting discussion with Church of Entropy about her idea that Christianity and Islam were was conceived of by Jews to prevent them from practicing usury, so Jews can corner the market.
It was largely post hoc. She didn't have any evidence from what Jews had tried to do before those religions started, but it was a post hoc thing because that happened. It must have been their intention.
Mhm.
So it's a common fallacy found in the news articles, especially those pertaining to some. Okay, so post hoc is very common, and there is reason to post hoc. I mean, post hoc is just because it happened, uh, you know, just because there is cause and effect, and one thing happened after the other doesn't mean that it was an example of cause and effect, and that's extremely common, and it's also something that needs to be thought out, and because cause and effect is an important thing to decipher. Dr. Renee, week in review, I was talking to her like medical diagnostics where you basically only have the current situation of the sick patient in front of you, and you have to determine what making them sick, and so you have to look at the current situation and derive what the cause was based on what is the current situation. And you wouldn't necessarily call medical diagnostic a post hoc fallacy. That's the only, you're just working with the only information you have. But I mean, it's a fallacy when you state it, and when you make it seem like more than it is.
Yes.
So slippery slope.
Falsely assuming that one thing will inevitably lead to another and another and another until we have reached some unavoidable dire consequence. It does not allow for the idea that one can stop at any point on the slope. It does not necessarily have to lead to the inevitable dire consequence. Restraint is possible.
Okay, any comments?
No.
Weak analogy.
Many arguments rely on an analogy between two or more objects, ideas, or situations. However, drawing an analogy alone is not enough to prove anything. It is crucial to make sure that the two things being compared to are truly alike in the relevant areas.
Any comment?
Um, no.
Appeal to authority.
This does not refer to appropriately citing an expert, but rather when an arguer tries to get people to agree with him or her by appealing to a supposed authority who isn't much of an expert. For example, gun laws should be
You don't have to read the
extreme.
example. I mean, if you want to give your own example or your own comment, people could read that on their own if they want.
Yeah.
You have any comment?
Well, I don't know. I just find it sort of too quick. I mean, that I need to read them in order to digest them. But yeah, I get the gist of it.
Okay, yeah, I've been over these so many times. I mean, appeal to authority is constantly, because so and so in religion generally, from a logical state, religion is almost always an appeal to authority, like Moses or the Quran. There's some sort of but so and so who is
Who
accepted
is a
authority.
Muslim or who is a Jew says this or that, and you think, well, are they, you know, are they actually even educated in their religion? And usually it isn't. It's just some, ignorant person who doesn't know his or her own religion,
Yeah,
possibly.
an appeal to pity, attempting to convince an individual to accept a conclusion by making them feel sorry for someone, or maybe shaming is like that. You're like, what kind of monster would think that? And hence, even if the logic dictates that that's the correct way to think about it. Appeal
Hmm.
to ignorance. Essentially, this fallacy states that because there is no conclusive evidence, we should therefore accept the arguer's conclusion on the subject. The arguer attempts to use lack of evidence as support for a positive claim about the truth of a conclusion. The exception of this fallacy is the case of qualified scientific research, who's saying, okay, uncertainty is the case. In a lot of cases, there is no legitimate conclusion, and the correct assessment is to just leave it as uncertain, but saying, well, so the appeal to ignorance is just would be to try to force an explanation when there's not one warranted.
Mhm.
Ad populum, bandwagon, one of your favorite ones to call out, also referred to as a bandwagon fallacy. The arguer tries to convince the audience to do or believe something because everyone else does, like you told me at the beginning when I was mentioning the majority of Jews reject their own religion.
Yes, and I'm saying, well, that means that they should be considered non-Jews if they reject their religion.
Ad hominem, attacking the opponent instead of the opponent's argument. Anyone comment on that?
Yes, because this is a favorite accusation of Church of Entropy, who regards anything. I mean, sometimes you do need to attack the opponent's motives for putting that particular argument. In a sort of, well, you would say that because you are,
Well,
what.
motives, it's a question of authority or the type of argument, where if motives makes a difference, there's many examples where motives makes no difference to the argument, and or if it's a person's authority where you're trying to weaken the authority of the person and therefore attacking the person weakens their authority. But in many cases, if a person's just asking a question or attacking your idea, and you're saying, well, what basis do you have me to ask that? And you're saying, just answer the question. I don't care about this person's motive or why they asked the question. I just want to know your answer to the point that they made.
Mhm. Yeah.
Tu quo quo.
In this fallacy, the arguer points out that the opponent has actually done the thing he or she is arguing against and concluding that we do not have to listen to the argument. So it would be a reformed criminal saying, "Don't do my crime." So don't do what I have already done, and then they might say, but you, I don't know.
Yeah, saying, listen to what I say, not what I do.
Yes, yes, and then you discover that the person has done that, and um,
So
but
here
but
it's saying
then
is a fallacy. So the daughter who tells her mother, they say, well, you used to smoke when you
don't
were my
smoke.
age, so why should I listen to you when you say don't smoke? And you're saying that's a fallacy to say, well, maybe the person, because they made that mistake, is giving you good and honest advice.
Yeah, because you look at me coughing my lungs out, but I still can't give up, and yeah. Mhm.
Straw man.
The arguer sets up the weaker version of the opponent's position and seeks to prove the watered down version rather than the position of the opponent actually holds. Through this misrepresentation, the arguer concludes that the real position has been refuted.
Yeah, this one's very mentioned in internet debates and it's extremely important. You also have the steel man. And sometimes it's very hard, the failure to communicate. Well, what did the person actually say? And so you're representing. So if you don't understand the person or you're opposed to the person, almost any idea in your head about what the person is accurately saying is going to be a straw man, saying like, oh, Claire has a legitimate view of secular Koranism that might actually benefit society, as opposed to someone who takes a negative approach, like, well, I can't even give a good explanation of what Claire's saying. So any explanation of what Claire's saying is going to be some sort of straw man that doesn't really state what she says because it's such a bad idea in the first place.
Well, yes, I mean, Aaron Hood says it's all, there's secular Quranists all over the Middle East now, and they're terrible people, and we don't want it because we've seen them and we don't like it, and then I have to say, well, it has never been tried anywhere.
Yeah, and sometimes you have to go through a series of straw men to really understand what the other person is saying. So, like, can't, they're saying, I understand your point. Like, I'm on the opposite school, but I understand your point and the logic behind it and why you might think it. And you might have to go through a series of straw men to really get to an understanding what the person's saying.
So you do have to test them, and unfortunately, some people get cross with you and say you're ad homing them.
Red herring.
The arguer goes off on a tangent midway through the argument, raising a side issue that distracts the audience from the actual argument.
Okay, you're very common. You're familiar with this one? The term with what it's saying?
Yeah, the red herring. It's an irrelevant argument.
False dichotomy?
In this fallacy, the arguer sets up the situation so that it looks as though there are only two choices. When the arguer then eliminates one of the choices, it appears that there is only one option left, the arguer's assertion. There is rarely only two choices. If we were to think about them all, it may not appear to be as clear a choice.
Yeah, I mean, it's somewhat related to multiple truth hypothesis. Saying like it's not always either
Or being binary.
begging the question.
The arguer asks the audience to simply accept the conclusion without providing any real evidence, either through the use of circular reasoning or by simply ignoring the important but questionable assumption that the argument rests on, harder to detect than many other fallacies. I can think of an example, which is to say that the universe is God.
Yeah, because the universe is God. It's circular. As opposed to having the fundamental form of an argument where you have premises and proofs leading to a conclusion, where you try to use your conclusion as the premises and the proofs of what you're trying to prove.
Yes, and I can think of another example, which is the one Christians often use when I point out that Christianity is idolatry, and they say, but if Christ is indeed divine, then we're not idolaters, are we?
Yeah. So equivocation.
Equivocation means to slide between two or more different meanings of a word or phrase that is critical to the argument. For an argument to work, the words must have the same meaning throughout the premise and the conclusion.
This is probably what a lot of people just refer to as pilpul. I mean, pilpul could be more than just this, but when people, a lot of time when they, people like that's pilpul, what they're probably calling out is equivocation.
Isn't Pilpul what any law student would be doing anyway, which is to examine, to define the meaning of the word and agree on it, on the meaning of a word before going on to argue about,
Yeah,
its
but I'm saying in
meaning.
the negative aspect, when people use pilpul as a pejorative. So I mean, to Doooovid, pilpul is a positive thing, but to many people in your stream, pilpul is a negative. And when they think of pilpul as a negative, they're probably thinking of pilpul as some form of equivocation. Some sort of word game trick.
Sophistry, perhaps.
Yeah. Okay, so how to prevent fallacies: pretend to argue against yourself, list the evidence for each of your main points, investigate your own personal fallacies, give the appropriate amount of proofs for your claims. Remember, broad claims need to more proof than narrow claims. Fairly characterize the arguments of others.
Mm.
So hopefully, moving forward in the debates, hopefully that will have been beneficial. I guess I'm going to end the screen share. I'm not sure if there's anyone in the chat who wants to hop on. I'm not sure if I should. I have to leave. I'm leaving in like 30 minutes. I don't know if you have anything else to say, or if I should just put the link, the Streamlabs link in the chat.
No, I've yeah, pretty much finished all I want to say. Well, thank you for having me, Doovid. And well, yeah, it's been fun. It's been very educational about Israeli politics, and I'm grateful for that.
Should I have OV come on for a few minutes, or should I just end the stream?
Do you want me to go?
I mean, you could stay. I don't mind. I might eat a Greek salad, but I put the link in the chat, so keep it friendly for mine, and we'll see if OV wants to add to anything that was said earlier, and maybe I'll eat my Greek salad while you two are talking, and
Okay.
so I'll say I put in the chat, so I don't want to wait too long. I have to leave. There's actually an event about the Rabbi and anti-Semitism, a film and discussion at a local Chabad house in my town. So the Rebbe, Lubavitch Rebbe, had an approach to anti-Semitism. So there's going to be a film and discussion, and it's about at 7:30. So that's like 50 minutes, and it's about a 20-minute drive from me. So that leaves me like half an hour, and I have a Greek salad I want to eat. So if OV pops on, um,
Yes, he seemed to say he wants. Oh, there he is.
Wait, Doovid, you're not going to leave right now, right? You're
I'm gonna
gonna.
leave in like 30 minutes. I'll
Oh,
probably
okay. All right.
shut the stream down. So if you want to stay on for like 25 minutes, then I gotta shut the stream on.
I can talk to Claire anytime, you know. But it's always good when I get a chance to BTFO Doovid on logic and all that kind of stuff.
On my own channel.
Yeah, on your own channel as well. Yeah.
I've selectively recruited Claire Khaw, became one of the most famous defenders of the Jewish people. I've recruited her to my channel, and now OV has he became like, who's that guy, the Beyond Hate, the Pickety guy who's always on the news. So now OV is one of the best defenders of the Jewish people too.
Is that true, David? I thought I'm not even Jewish, according to our conversation a couple days ago.
You don't have to be Jewish to be a defender of the Jewish people.
Oh, well, fair point. Yeah. So how am I a good defender of the Jews? I'm kind of curious. Actually, apparently that's the same argument that all the Wignets have. Apparently, I'm a traitor to the white race because I have people like Brundlefly on my channel.
Who's that guy who was always on? Was it Life After Hate?
Life After. I'm not familiar with that name.
The guy who's always on the media when they need an expert about like the white nationalism, neo-Nazis. The guy with all the tattoos, the Pickety or something, Pickety.
I'm not familiar, to be honest.
Guy.
Oh, you're talking about. I know who you're talking about. What's his name?
I can't even find his name. I forget the name of his
organization. Oh, hold on. Let me pull it up.
He's always the go-to guy on like the news when they have like, he was like, as a former
on the news,
on like the mainstream news, CNN, MSNBC, and like.
Was he like a Marine?
No, he was in like some band, and he's actually Italian also.
Wait, you're not talking about Mufashi Bookshelf, are you?
No, I'm saying this guy's like an he works for the ADL now.
Oh wow, no, I'm not familiar with him at all.
He's on the major news things, and he goes around and speaking at like Holocaust museums and to Jewish organizations, talking about like how he used to be a neo-Nazi and how he left, and tries to talk other people out of it.
Is that the guy that was? Did he do a segment on what's her name's show?
Piccanelli or something like that. I don't know what his name is.
I'm not familiar, to be honest. I mean, there's a few people around that kind of fit that description. But as far as the person that you seem to be,
Christian Piccolini.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with who that is. No.
He was on PBS. I put it in. I'll put the link in the chat. But he's the one that's on like. I mean, there might be a few of them, but I say you're the new Christian Piccanelli now.
Wow. David knows how to bring the insults.
Okay, I'll keep it clean from my channel. Keep it to logic. Or were you watching the stream?
No, I just jumped online and I just saw it. So I didn't. I saw just the last few minutes of it.
Okay, I gotta get my Greek salad, so you two have fun.
All right. So, well, I'd rather talk to Doovid than talk to Claire because
I'm so sorry to be a disappointment, but
it's just because I never get to talk to Doovid. Doovid is like that special guest that comes on only once in a while.
Do you want to ask a particular question? Maybe I could deal with the questions you want to ask.
Well, to keep it in theme with what you guys were just talking about, one of the last logical fallacies that you were dealing with was the false dichotomy, and I mean, it's. I think that's a great logical fallacy to bring up in your presence, Claire, because your entire ideological premise is based upon a false dichotomy.
Yes.
Yeah. Can you hear us? We're here, Doovid. I don't know. Can chat hear us?
Yeah, I can hear you loud and clear, and Doovid too.
Yeah, I can hear you now. Can you hear me?
All right. Yeah, we can hear you. Yeah.
Okay, I just got up to get my Greek salad.
All right. So, Claire, speaking of logical fallacies, um, I mean, you you are probably the poster child for the false dichotomy when it comes to ideology. I mean, the whole idea that because Christianity has failed, therefore we need to adopt secular Koranism. I mean, isn't that the most base, the most perfect kind of a false dichotomy?
Well, if you don't agree with my choice, then supply me with another one,
I mean, there's multiple other ones. That's the whole point.
such as.
Oh, I mean, we could go back to paganism. I mean, that's paganism is more likely to happen than secular Koranism, to be honest.
Really?
Yeah.
Is it what you prefer?
Now, preference is a completely different thing.
Well, do you think it's that there's time to start a new religion that
Wait.
people in desperate need of it?
Paganism isn't a new religion.
Well, I don't know of any form of paganism that might work. I can't even think of one. And you can't either. It's like, yeah, in theory there is this paganism.
wait. Now you're putting words in my mouth.
QST, are you talking about QST?
QST? No, absolutely not. No. But there's, I mean, it kind of, who's to say that we? Well, here's my issue, right? Is that before we get into any specific kind of religion, I don't even believe in the idea that you need a one uniting religion in order to have a one united society.
Why don't you think that it is necessary?
I mean, that's your position.
Yeah,
Actually,
it's like you have to have the shared values, and if you'd arrived at the earlier part of the discussion, which was all about Jewish identity and the divisions in Israeli society, you would realize that even the Jews are having a lot of problems now about what they want to be and how they want to define themselves, and so things are.
That's a great thing. That's a great thing.
Yeah, and but that's because they won't interpret their rules in a uniform way, so that causes division and opposition and
Well, Claire, it's funny that you look to Jews to be somehow unified, but of all of the religious or cultural doctrines, Jews are the least unified out of any of the major religions.
well, they seem to have the most, as Jen would say, cult prestige.
No, they have the most ethnic prestige.
Yeah, so that's something, isn't it?
Well, I'm not. No, don't be so quick to think that's a good thing. I mean, if I know you're not necessarily an advocate of ethno-nationalism.
But I would have thought you'd be very keen on this idea.
Oh yeah, I love to use it as a wedge issue. Totally.
So it's sort of like if you want an ideology, then it's like the best, the most powerful model must surely be Judaism, right? I mean, it's not anything else because it's a form of divine ethno-nationalism. So if you're
What makes it divine?
well, because it's supposed to come from God, God's chosen people, the fact that the world's most ancient and powerful tribe, that kind of thing.
But they're not the most ancient tribe, and they're I mean,
who is more ancient?
And powerful is a frame of reference.
Well, everybody's complaining about them and saying they run the world. So, well, who else if not the Jews?
Well, yes, I mean that's the thing, right? You mean but running the room or running the world through the back room is one thing, but that power only goes so far when you actually have to assert yourself in a public space.
What do you mean? They're always asserting themselves in a public place.
In certain forms, yes, but not. But definitely not in all forms. And I mean, let's go back to. I mean, any time that Israel wants to invade Lebanon, right, or wants to take down another country, I mean, they have more failures than they have successes.
Okay, so nobody hates and fears Israel after all. I kind of got the different.
Oh, look at the logical fallacy right there, putting words in my mouth. Yeah, nice straw man, Claire.
The impression I get mixing in the circles that we mix in, I get the impression that they're all powerful and responsible for all the ills of Western society, and now you're kind of saying, oh, they're nothing at all. They're not even the world's most ancient and powerful race. We don't have to worry about them because they keep.
They're not the most ancient race. I don't know where you get that from. That's completely archaeologically ignorant statement.
But who is?
Well, I mean, you look at the Amalekites. Even the Amalekites were around before Israel.
Yeah, but nobody calls themselves Amalekites.
So just because a certain society does not exist anymore means that Jews automatically get the ribbon, the badge of honor of being the most ancient society.
Well, that's not accurate. The Amalekites are actually come from
contemporary, you could say.
No, I mean they're
At
after
best.
Jacob. In fact, that it comes from someone who.
And where do you get this information from, David?
It's in the Bible.
So are you begging the question, David?
No, you said that Amalekite.
It's in the Bible. Well, the Bible says it. The Bible says
they
it.
pre-exist Moses, but they don't pre-exist Jacob. I mean, certainly according to the Bible.
Well, according to the Bible. According to the
Bible.
Yeah.
Well, so even according to the Bible, the Jews aren't the most ancient culture. I mean, Abraham.
Oh, great. Okay. Interesting.
Abraham has to leave Babylon. And there's already cultures in
the
Israel,
Assyrians, the Babylonians,
Egypt,
the city of Ur, yeah.
I mean, that's not even a claim of Judaism itself that we're the most ancient civilization.
Okay, well, good, great. So we're on the same page with that.
I mean, we're an old civilization. We've had definitely thousands of years. We've pretty cohesive way of life for a few thousand of those, possibly going back 3,500 years.
Yeah, we could actually. Jared Thompson brings up, the Egyptians were older. The ancient Chinese were older. The Hindus were older. Yeah.
Yeah, it was making even according to the Bible itself, the Jews are come later. Noah has his 70 nations, 70 grandchildren that go off and form the nations, and Abraham comes from one of those nations, 10 generations after Noah. So by the time, 10 generations after Noah is Abraham. So already by the time of Abraham, there's many nations that are fully developed.
Yeah. Yeah. So Claire, you can just leave that whole. I know you love to butter up the Jews a whole bunch in order to, for your political purposes, but you got to at least be.
That's why I brought her on. She's like our best defender these days.
She loves to deny it, though. That's the funny thing. But she's not very good at denying it either.
Relying on Claire to defend the Jews is not a winning strategy.
Yeah, that's what you need Gandalf for. Gandalf will be the true deliverer of Greater Israel.
Well, my position on Greater Israel has been pretty clear. If Israel wants to spend its own blood and treasure and expand itself in the Middle East, I don't care. It's not my business. I'm not someone who's, and I don't favor banning people if they support BDS, but I don't support BDS. It's stupid.
What's stupid about BDS?
Because I don't care about the Palestinians. It's not my problem. I don't want to be involved in their issues. They're not, I'm not related to them. I don't care. And Israel's a fact for right now, and Israelis live there, and leave them alone.
Well, Israelis
there's well
and
over
Palestinians
10,000
live there.
Palestinians in Chicago. There's like a whole section of Chicago that has like at least 10,000, maybe 20,000 Palestinians.
Well, I know where that area is. They own several restaurants up on Damon and Lawrence, and actually there's some good restaurants up there. There's
They don't own any banks, though.
But my point is, like, taking sides in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, I just don't. Like, it's not on my radar. It's not something I focus on. And Israel seems to have the most power. And fine, they can use the power however they want. And if the Palestinians want to revolt and do whatever they want to get it back on their own, fine. It's not my conflict. I don't really want to be involved in it.
So you just want to go. You want to go along with whoever has the most power, is what you're saying.
No, I said between those two parties, I don't really have like a side. Default is
why did you bring up the power aspect then?
Well, power does matter in international affairs, doesn't it?
Right. So and yet you have a problem with BDS. I mean,
because it's stupid. It's a waste of time.
Is BDS not a way to take away power from the Israelis?
Boycotting is in general a pretty stupid strategy. It doesn't really work it hasn't really worked in 50 years. The last time it sort of worked was the Montgomery bus boycott, and that was because they had elite support.
Dude, I can give you a kind of minor example. I mean, you look at the way that feminism has gone, and you look at American society, where in Hollywood they're trying to push, for example, the Star Wars franchise, where Star Wars was the most powerful franchise that had the most bulletproof kind of how do you put it, name in Hollywood. And yet, as soon as the Jews got involved and started pushing all of this feminist bullshit, Star Wars went in the tank.
Well, how do you explain the fact that Jews were involved with Star Wars in the 1970s versus their involvement now? Was it Jews then who ruined it back then? I mean, by that metric, Star Wars.
Who were the Jews?
4, 5, and 6 were bad too.
Who were the Jews involved in Star Wars in the 1970s?
The studios which probably released it, for all I know. I don't know.
Well, yeah.
Why does this even matter? I mean,
you're asking for an example.
What, are people boycotting the new Star Wars movies? I know the new Star Wars movies are terrible, but
everyone is boycotting it.
Yeah, because they're putting out a shitty product. I mean, that's a wholly different reason to like.
Oh, a shitty product. The whole political. How do you put it? The whole idea of political PR of the settlements is not bad. Bad PR either, right?
I kind of don't really care. I mean, fine. They want to build settlements, and the Palestinians can't kick them off the settlements. So what?
Wow, Gandalf, you are just the most cucky of cuckies, man.
Well, you're arguing principle or self-interest. Or you just think self-interest? There's no self-interest of his.
Principle. It's not principle or self-interest. All Gandalf cares about is who can be beneficial to Gandalf. That's all he cares about.
No,
it's all self-interest, is what it is. And it's kind of funny, kind of ironic that it's all self-interest, because that's what we were talking about the other day, right, David? Self-interest. What is self-interest? I mean, is it in your self-interest, David, to? Well,
you say OB. If you say it's in your self-interest to take the side of Israel over Palestine, but because of principle, you're choosing the side of Palestine over Israel.
I don't think it is in my self-interest to take the side of...
You're saying both. It's not actually in your self-interest, and it's a matter of principle. As opposed to Gandalf, he's saying he doesn't really care about the principle of the matter. He's just purely thinking in terms of self-interest.
And that's the naivete, right, of Gandalf's self-interest, is that taking Israel's side is not actually in his self-interest. He may think it is, but it's not.
Well, it's also the strength of my commitment to it. It's sort of my like, I don't really care what it does in the West Bank. It's not my business.
Oh, but it is. I mean,
why should I care what Israeli settlers do in the West Bank? I don't care whether they sing Kumbaya with Palestinians or massacre them all. It doesn't matter to me.
Well, yeah,
it's like the Israeli argument they always give. You're like, how come you don't boycott every single other bad actor on the planet? When are you going to boycott Saudi Arabia or boycott China, which is like the common argument you always hear?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but that's not really the point that I'm making. The issue is that, Gandalf Doovid, are you familiar with Gandalf's position? How he thinks he's going to take power in the West with his QST and become like the theocratic dictator?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I like, let's not discuss that. I mean, saying he's welcome to that, but that's not the topic
Well,
here
I mean,
of what we're
it goes
discussing
straight
now.
to the heart of the issue. I mean, the more power that you give a hardline Orthodox Israel, I mean, the less power that everyone else has. So Gandalf thinks he's somehow going to take power, but if Greater Israel exists, I mean, what do you think? Gandalf isn't going to end up dead? When he's campaigning
Well,
for
I mean, because
his.
politics is politics, just like Netanyahu will team up with Viktor Orban or Borsellino. Maybe
Bolsonaro.
Netanyahu,
Yeah.
Bolsonaro, maybe Netanyahu would team up with Gandalf if it was beneficial to him. And that's basically what he's saying. Like, you could have Chicago as long as you turn a blind eye to everything that Israel's doing.
Why should I care what Israel does in its own backyard? If Israel does stuff outside of its own backyard, then I should care. If it's not,
Well, I mean, Israel.
in the case of the Palestinians,
do you
I
deny?
don't care.
Do you deny that Israel does stuff out of its own backyard?
Lots of foreign powers do, and that's the problem. Israel's
like
just
who?
one of many.
Well, I mean, you could say that America does stuff out of its own backyard.
So does
but actually,
China.
I
So
would
does
say
Russia.
no. Russia does not act out of its own backyard. China does not really either. I mean,
What do you
maybe,
call Russia putting military bases in Venezuela that could host nuclear bombers?
Oh, that's well. See, that's
Yeah, but what do you call
here's
like OPEC? I mean, you might not be in the same political sense, but I mean, certainly that you have OPEC and the world manipulation of oil prices. You have China and Japan that have possibly manipulated currencies or manufacturing prices in a different way than Israel or the U.S. might.
that's an
Then
interesting point. Well, I mean, America does that as well. To be honest, I mean the whole point of the
those are
U.S.
known
dollar.
examples. You know that Japan and China both purposely flooded the market with cheaper goods for whatever benefit that they thought internationally that would lead themselves
And
to. And
who gave
OPEC
who
floods either floods or tightens the oil market to control prices.
and who was the first person to go to China in the 1970s? Tubin?
Gandalf's hero.
No,
Who's going?
Henry Kissinger and Nixon.
Yeah, it was Kissinger that went first. Kissinger went before Nixon. So I mean, yeah. So if you bring up the whole China issue, I mean, you're essentially talking about the Israeli issue or the Jewish question of them acting outside of their backyard.
No, Kissinger
But
has a very
in the
complex
Jewish
relation. No, Kissinger has a very complex relationship with the Israeli question. He was one of the few,
Oh, okay.
no. He's one of the few Jews in the elite that were more on the side of the Rockefellers and the WASPs, and not on the side of the burgeoning neoliberals and neoconservatives with which most Jews in the deep state then were involved.
The
Kissinger is his
Rockefellers
own
aren't
thing.
neoliberals. Okay, yeah,
No,
very hot take
the
there.
Rockefellers kind of fell out of favor in the 80s and 90s, and it's been a steady
Oh
decline.
yeah.
ever since.
The Rockefellers have no power whatsoever. Yeah.
That's not what I said. I said they sort of fell out of favor and fell a few rungs down the totem pole, in part because Nelson Rockefeller kept meddling in foreign affairs, and the Iranian hostage crisis really wrecked David Rockefeller's prestige on Wall Street.
Which is the power that has the most influence today in American politics, if not the Rockefellers?
Well, it's a House of Rothschild. I mean, that's obvious.
Oh wait, the Rothschilds are
Clinton book.
Jewish. You know the
Yes.
Rothschilds are Jewish, right?
Yes.
Oh, so
But do they? But do
I
they
mean, how does
speak?
this help your argument?
But do they speak for like every Jew?
No. Well, I mean, they speak for. You'd be surprised, right? And by the way, there's some echo coming from you, Gandalf. Yeah.
Sorry.
So here's the thing, right? When it comes to the Jewish question, you will always have the individual Jews who believe their own individual things. Like Doooovid or Shlomo Gordon. Or you have the left in Israel who is pro homo shit, and then you have the right in Israel who is the Netanyahu kind of camps, very orthodox that want Israel to just dominate all of the Levant. But at the end of the day, they will never they will never go against their own collective Jewish interest. They'll never advocate for going back to the 1967 borders or even prior to that, which is probably more important, right?
And why do I care about the 1967 borders? What does that have to do with me?
Well, do
who lives
you
in the
care about
Midwest?
international law?
I'm not a big proponent of international law. I don't particularly care for that whole tradition.
Why not?
Because it's pretty much irrelevant to the anarchic state of global politics and the fact that neoliberalism's in pretty steep decline. Oh, is that a deer?
Yeah, I got a deer right in my front yard.
What, is it just eating your grass or your flowers? What the hell is it doing?
It's just eating my grass. Pretty cool.
Deer, the king of the forest.
Doooovid, friend of the deer, is gonna let him eat my grass.
No, it's because I'm here, Doovid. That's why.
You're like a deer.
Yeah, under the Mayan astrology, my personality is the deer, actually.
Well, that
Okay.
means that Gandalf the Predator will have to eat you for venison.
Final words. I'll encourage you to. It looks like Claire left.
Oh, Claire left? Oh.
So I'll encourage you to keep on streaming if you want to migrate to Gandalf or Claire's channel, but I got to run. So if either of you want to give some final words.
Oh, I'm going to
run.
Luke.
Okay. So OV, anything you want to say?
Heil Hitler.
Okay, God forbid. Well, thanks for coming on anyways. Gandalf.
Thanks for having me on, Doooovid. I appreciate it. One of these days we'll go over the logic stuff and do other stuff besides, endlessly arguing. Well, one book we should probably do is the Yuri Avner book on the prime ministers. That might be interesting. I know a fair amount about Israeli politics, and I have a pretty nuanced view of it. I mean, I'm not someone who takes very super ideologically charged mainstream positions on it, either for or against. So I have probably a different take on it than most people.
Well, yeah, I mean, talk about that with Luke Ford. I'll try to catch what you say.
All right.
When I come back. Okay, thanks for coming on, everybody. Have a great night. Thanks for tuning in. Thanks for Claire for her questions about principles and initiating this stream. Hopefully it's useful. Later tonight, when I have time, I'll go back and timestamp the table of contents to make viewing it easier for the people who just want to see selected parts of it. So have a great night, everybody. God bless.
Sigal.